The silver vinaigrette struck the floor with a sound too small for the damage it caused. A bright, delicate crack rang beneath the chandeliers of the Queen's Crescent subscription rooms, and every lady at the long mahogany table looked down before anyone looked at Emmeline Maresfield. For one suspended moment, the little silver box lay between the polished boots of Mr. Tobias Fletchley and the hem of Emmeline's dove-coloured gown, its engraved lavender sprig catching the late autumn light from the tall Mayfair windows. Then Tobias shifted his weight. His heel came down upon the hinge. The sound was not loud. It did not need to be. Emmeline felt it in her hand as if he had stepped upon her fingers instead. Until that instant, she had believed a woman might be abandoned with dignity if she kept her voice even, her spine straight, and her eyes from filling. She had been wrong. London, in the year 1843, was perfectly willing to watch a woman's heart be broken, provided the tea was hot and the subscription book remained open. The room had been arranged for benevolence, coal for widows, blankets for children, soup tickets for old men who had lost sons to fever or factory accidents. The patronesses of the Queen's Crescent Fund sat in pale silks and dark merinos, their gloves resting beside purses fat with promised guineas. A coal fire burned behind a brass guard. Silver urns steamed. Calling cards lay in neat piles. Names were entered, sums confirmed, thanks murmured. Emmeline had been asked to assist because her handwriting was clear and her manners quieter than grief. That was what Mrs. Alwyn, her mother's cousin and present chaperone, had said when she placed the pen in Emmeline's hand that morning. "You have a steady way about you, my dear. People trust a woman who does not flutter." Emmeline had smiled because steadiness was often praised by those who never asked what it cost. She had written the first 20 pledges without error. Lady Quince had given £5, and looked as though she expected the poor to be grateful for the trouble she had taken to remember them. Lady Marcella Quince, seated just behind her mother, had given nothing directly, but had allowed her name to be admired as if admiration itself could warm a widow's grate. Tobias had arrived late. He came with the careless ease of a gentleman who believed lateness was only another form of importance. Emmeline had looked up when his shadow fell across the ledger. She had expected an apology, perhaps even some light remark about the crowd on Bond Street. They were to be married within 6 weeks. A fiancé, even a distracted one, could be forgiven a late arrival to a charity meeting if he brought warmth in his eyes. Tobias brought no warmth. His gaze moved over her as one might inspect a letter already answered. "Miss Maresfield," he said, and the formality stopped her breath. Around them, pens paused. A spoon touched porcelain and did not stir again. Emmeline set her fingers around her mother's silver vinaigrette. It was an old habit, older than Tobias, older than her engagement, older even than the careful economies that had thinned the Maresfield household after her father's death. The vinaigrette had belonged to her mother, a small oval box no larger than a lady's palm, engraved with a sprig of lavender and filled with a faint sharpness of aromatic vinegar. Her mother had carried it to crowded rooms, sick beds, parish meetings, and one dreadful funeral at which she had not fainted, because Maresfield women, she had whispered afterward, were allowed to bend but not to fall. Emmeline did not open it. She merely held it. "Mr. Fletchley," she answered. Her voice sounded calm enough to satisfy strangers. His mouth tightened. "I had hoped to speak privately, but circumstances have made privacy unhelpful." A stir passed through the room. Lady Marcella lowered her lashes. but not before Emmeline saw the glitter beneath them. Mrs. Alwine pushed back her chair. "Mr. Fletchley, this is hardly the place." "On the contrary," Tobias said, "it is precisely the place. Miss Maresfield is among friends, or at least among ladies inclined toward compassion." He smiled then, and Emmeline understood that whatever he had come to do, he had rehearsed it. "I regret that I must release Miss Maresfield from our engagement." The words did not strike all at once. They arrived like cold water poured slowly down the back. Release, as if she had been holding him, as if she had clung, as if he were performing a mercy. Emmeline did not move. A younger lady near the window drew in a soft, delighted breath and disguised it as a cough. Lady Quince's face arranged itself into sorrow. Marcella looked at Tobias with practiced pain, just enough to be seen. "May I ask?" Emmeline said. "What circumstances have made cruelty more convenient than honesty?" A few heads lifted. Tobias flushed. He had expected tears. She saw that and found, beneath humiliation, one narrow blade of satisfaction. "There is no need for bitterness," he said. "No." Her thumb pressed against the dented edge of the vinaigrette's lid. "Then there must be need for truth." Tobias glanced toward Marcella. It was a brief look, but it opened the whole room. "My affections have altered," he said. "Lady Marcella has honored me with an understanding that better suits my future." A whisper ran from chair to chair. It moved faster than flame along paper. Emmeline felt Mrs. Alwine's hand hover near her shoulder, not touching, afraid that touch would make pity visible. Marcella rose with the grace of a woman accepting a coronet rather than another woman's broken promise. "Miss Maresfield," she said softly, "I hope one day you'll see that a gentleman must choose where his prospects are not diminished." Emmeline looked at her. "I hope one day you'll learn the difference between being chosen and being useful." Marcella's colour sharpened. Tobias stepped closer. "That is enough. I meant to spare you greater embarrassment." "You have an odd way of sparing people. You should be grateful I speak plainly. A woman in reduced circumstances cannot afford scenes." He reached for her hand, then, perhaps to remove the ring he had given her, perhaps only to prove that he could still command the moment. Emmeline drew back. His fingers caught her wrist. The vinaigrette slipped. Silver flashed. It fell. The little box struck the floor. Tobias released her at once, but too late. She bent instinctively. So did he. His boot came down before either hand could reach it. The hinge gave way under his heel. For a second, no one breathed. Then a voice from the doorway said, "Remove your foot." It was not a loud command. It did not need to be. The room turned as one body. A gentleman stood beneath the high arch of the entrance, his dark coat severe, his gloves held in one hand, his face cut by the pale light behind him. Emmeline knew him at once, though they had never been introduced. Everyone knew the Duke of Briarcliff. His Grace, Philip Saint, Aldren, was spoken of in drawing-rooms with the peculiar relish society reserved, for men it feared too much to insult directly. Some called him cold, some called him proud, some, when careless with wine, called him the Briarcliff wolf. He had an old scar near his temple, nearly hidden by the line of his dark hair, and the stillness of a man who had learned that silence could make weaker people confess themselves. Tobias removed his boot. The crushed vinaigrette lay exposed, its hinge bent, its lid slightly sprung. The Duke crossed the room. No one blocked him. Even Lady Quince seemed to remember that an earl's widow, however influential, did not command a duke. He stopped before the broken silver, lowered himself just enough to pick it up with care, and turned it in his gloved hand. His gaze rested on the engraved lavender sprig, something changed in his expression. It was not softness, not yet. It was recognition sharpened by anger. "Does breaking a lady's inheritance make you feel less indebted, Mr. Fletchley?" Tobias stiffened. "Your Grace, this is a private matter. You chose an audience." The Duke looked at the long table, the subscription book, the frozen patronesses, and then back at Tobias. "Now you have one." Marcella recovered first. "Your Grace, Miss Maresfield is naturally distressed." Mr. Fletchley only wished to end matters quietly. The Duke's eyes did not leave Tobias. Quietly, he held up the damaged vinaigrette. "Quietly has left a mark." Emmeline felt the room looking at her hand. A faint red line showed where Tobias's grip had pressed against the skin near her wrist. She lowered her fingers, not in shame, but to keep them still. The Duke saw the movement. More importantly, he did not mistake it for permission to speak for her. He placed the vinaigrette on the table in front of Emmeline, not into her hand. The gesture was so small that anyone else might have missed it. Emmeline did not. He left the choice to her. She looked at the crushed silver box. Its lid sat crooked. The lavender sprig was scarred, but visible. She reached for it herself. The room remained silent while she closed her fingers around her mother's ruined keepsake. "Miss Maresfield," the Duke said, his voice lower now, "what would you like this room to know?" Tobias made a sound of protest. The Duke did not turn. Emmeline felt the question settle around her. Not what had happened, not what Tobias claimed, not what society would prefer. What would she like the room to know? Her throat tightened, but her voice did not break. "Mr. Fletchley may abandon me," she said. "He may not rewrite me." Somewhere near the fire, Mrs. Aldren covered her mouth. Lady Marcella's eyes narrowed. Tobias's face darkened with the unpleasant surprise of a man who had expected a discarded woman to behave like a discarded thing. The Duke inclined his head, as though Emmeline had answered not only well, but finally. Then he looked to the charity treasurer, a nervous gentleman with ink on his cuff. "You will record Mr. Fletchley's withdrawal from the widow's coal pledge exactly as witnessed." The treasurer swallowed. "Yes, Your Grace. And you will note that Miss Maresfield's hand was forced away from the ledger before the disturbance." "Yes, Your Grace." Tobias stepped forward. "You exceed yourself, sir." The Duke turned then. "No, you mistook the room. That is not the same thing." A chill moved through the gathering. It was one thing to be cruel to a woman in reduced circumstances. It was another to discover that the most feared Duke in London had chosen to remember every word. Emmeline stood very still, the vinaigrette held against her palm. Beneath its damaged lid, something gave the faintest rattle. Not the broken hinge, something inside. The Duke heard it too. His eyes dropped to the silver box, then lifted to hers. For the first time that morning, Emmeline saw curiosity in him, and something more dangerous than curiosity. Purpose. "Miss Maresfield," he said, with formal care, "you are not without protection." The room absorbed the sentence like a scandal. Emmeline should have felt relief. Instead, she felt the edge of a mystery opening beneath her feet. Because the Duke of Briarcliff had not looked at her as though he had found a woman to pity. He had looked at her as though her mother's broken silver box had just answered a question he had been carrying for years. By the time Emmeline returned to Mrs. Aldren's modest drawing room in Half Moon Street, the story had already arrived before her. It had not arrived whole. Stories seldom did in London. They came trimmed, perfumed, sharpened, and arranged to flatter whoever had released them first. By 4 o'clock, according to the breathless maid who opened the door, Miss Maresfield had been jilted because of unpaid dowry promises, had fainted against the subscription table, had accused Mr. Tobias Fletchley of fraud without evidence, and had somehow drawn the attention of the Duke of Briarcliff by making a scene over a trinket. The maid said none of this aloud after one glance at Mrs. Alwyn's face. She took Emmeline's bonnet and gloves in silence, though her eyes dropped to the small silver vinaigrette clutched in Emmeline's hand. Its hinge sat crooked. The lid did not close. Each step from the hired carriage to the drawing-room had made the hidden thing inside give a faint rattle, as if her mother's keepsake had found a voice only after being crushed. Mrs. Alwyn shut the door with care. "Sit down, my dear. If I sit down, I may remember to shake." "Then shake sitting. It is less dangerous to the furniture." Emmeline almost smiled. Almost. She crossed to the small sofa by the fire and lowered herself onto it, keeping the vinaigrette in her lap. Her wrist had begun to ache where Tobias had gripped her, not sharply, but with a dull insistence that made his fingers seem present, even after he had gone. A thin red mark curved near the bone. She had refused to look at it in the carriage. She looked now and felt less wounded by the mark than by the fact that he had expected her to hide it for him. Mrs. Alwyn knelt to stir the fire herself, though a bell-pull hung within reach. His Grace's carriage remained outside Queen's Crescent for several minutes after ours departed. Emmeline lifted her eyes. "Did it? Do not pretend indifference with me. I am too old to reward bad acting. I am not indifferent. I am confused. That is wiser." Mrs. Alwyn rose and stood with her hands folded. Her cap ribbons trembled faintly, the only visible sign of her anger. A duke does not insert himself into a broken engagement over a crushed silver box unless he recognizes either the lady, the gentleman, or the danger. Emmeline looked down at the lavender sresprig engraved on the bent lid. He recognized this. The words had scarcely left her mouth when the housemaid appeared again, pale with importance. "Mrs. Alwyn, His Grace the Duke of Briarcliff has called." Silence settled. It was not the cruel silence of the subscription room. It was the kind that arrives when an ordinary afternoon discovers it has become a turning point. Mrs. Alwyn drew herself up. "Show His Grace into the front parlour. Leave the door open. Tell Thomas to remain in the hall." She turned to Emmeline. "You are under my roof. You will not be spoken to alone. I would not ask it, no, but powerful men often forget women have not asked." Emmeline closed her fingers around the vinaigrette. "I do not think he forgets much." The Duke entered the front parlour 3 minutes later, with neither haste nor apology, yet nothing in his manner presumed welcome. He bowed first to Mrs. Alwyn, then to Emmeline. He had removed his hat and carried no cane. His dark coat was unmarked by the damp street air, his cravat severe, his expression controlled. In a richer house, he might have looked like judgment. In Mrs. Alwyn's parlour, among faded blue chairs and a fire that smoked in poor weather, he looked almost too large for the room, not in body but in consequence. "Mrs. Alwyn," he said, "Miss Maresfield, I am grateful you received me." Mrs. Alwyn sat in the chair nearest the open door. "We received your card, Your Grace. Gratitude is premature." Something almost moved at the corner of his mouth. "Then I will earn it slowly." Emmeline had not expected that. Men like Tobias grew offended when women guarded doors. The Duke appeared to approve of the door being guarded. He remained standing until Mrs. Alwyn gestured to a chair. Even then, he did not sit too near Emmeline. His gaze rested once upon her wrist. It did not linger, yet she knew he had seen the mark. "Mr. Fletchley has already begun to repair himself at your expense," he said. "That is quick work." Cowardice often is. Mrs. Alwyne's brows rose. The Duke turned his gloves once in his hand. Forgive the plainness. I do not know how much time delicacy has left us. Emmeline straightened. Time before what? Before Mr. Fletchley attempts to make the broken engagement appear to be your financial failure rather than his social betrayal. She felt the words strike. He mentioned the dowry. He will contest the receipt. He will imply that your family misrepresented what could be settled. He may also suggest that you sought to entangle him before your circumstances were discovered. Mrs. Alwyne's cheeks coloured. Monstrous. Useful, the Duke corrected coldly. Monstrous things are often useful to those without honour. Emmeline studied him, and you know this because Tobias is careless, because debt makes men repetitive. The answer came too quickly to be a guess. Mr. Fletchley owes money. Yes. To you? No. The Duke's face hardened. If he owed it to me, he would not have smiled this morning. Mrs. Alwyne made a small sound despite herself. Emmeline did not look away. Then to whom? To interests tied to Lady Quince's circle. I do not yet know how tightly. I know enough to say his new attachment is not made of affection alone. The fire clicked. Outside, carriage wheels passed over wet stones. Emmeline had imagined betrayal as a single wound. Now it opened into corridors. Why come here, Your Grace? She asked. A warning could have been sent by note. A note can be intercepted. A call can be witnessed. He looked briefly toward Mrs. Alwyne. And after this morning, Miss Maresfield's protection must be visible, or it will be denied. Protection, Emmeline repeated. The word had followed her all day, first from his mouth, then through the shocked faces of women who had never wondered whether she wanted it. That is a generous word. It can also become a cage. Yes, the simplicity of his answer unsettled her more than argument would have done. He placed his gloves on the small table beside him, not carelessly, but as if removing a barrier before touching anything that belonged to her. Then he looked at the vinaigrette in her lap. May I ask you to set that down where we may all see it? He did not say, give it to me. He did not extend his hand. Emmeline noticed both omissions. Slowly, she placed the damaged silver box on the table between them. The Duke leaned forward enough to examine it, but did not lift it. The lavender sprig, he said. It was my mother's mark, Emmeline replied. Not a crest, only a private engraving. Mrs. Maresfield served on charitable committees. Yes, when she was well enough, she believed accounts were a moral matter. Mrs. Alwyne's face softened with memory. She used to say a missing shilling had a face somewhere, even if gentlemen did not care to see it. The Duke went very still. She said that? Often, Emmeline said. Why? For the first time he did not answer at once. His eyes had changed, not softened exactly, but drawn inward, because my mother wrote the same sentence in a letter I was not meant to find until after she died. Emmeline's breath caught. Mrs. Alwyne's hand tightened on the arm of her chair, the late Duchess of Briarcliff. Yes, his voice lowered. Years ago, she was accused of allowing charitable funds to be misdirected. The matter was buried as a nervous confusion after her death. Society prefers dead women quiet. But there were records, duplicate accounts, a witness who refused to let error become guilt. He looked at the vinaigrette again. Her name was Maresfield. The room seemed to tilt around Emmeline. Her mother, who had stretched candles, mended cuffs, copied accounts by lamplight, and died with ink stains still beneath one thumbnail, had left some part of herself inside a scandal Emmeline had never been told existed. You knew my mother? No, I knew what her handwriting saved. Then this morning, This morning I saw Mr. Fletchley trying to ruin the daughter of a woman whose honesty once stood between my mother and disgrace." He paused. "At first, the name stopped me. Then you did." Emmeline's fingers curled against her skirt. It was not praise, as Tobias had given praise, smooth and cheap. It cost him something to say it, that made it harder to dismiss. "You are telling me you came here because of an old debt. I came because of a present danger. The old debt only made me recognize it faster. And what do you intend to do with that recognition?" Mrs. Alwyn murmured. "Emmeline." "No," the Duke said. "She is right to ask." He sat back. "Mr. Fletchley will move quickly. Lady Marcella will move more quietly. By tomorrow, there may be a version of events in which you were desperate, grasping, and fortunate to be discarded. If he contests the dowry receipt, he may delay any proper settlement and darken your name further. If Lady Quince's circle is involved, they will not be content with ending an engagement. They will make your mother's papers look suspect before anyone asks why they want them." Emmeline felt the rattle of the vinaigrette in memory. "You think this contains something?" "I think Mr. Fletchley stepped on it too hard for a man who merely lost his temper." The room chilled. Mrs. Alwyn crossed herself almost invisibly, then seemed embarrassed by the impulse. "What are you proposing, Your Grace?" The Duke's gaze returned to Emmeline. "Marriage." The word fell cleanly. No flourish, no tenderness, no attempt to disguise its force. Emmeline stared at him. Mrs. Alwyn rose halfway from her chair. "Your Grace, you cannot possibly expect." "I expect nothing." He spoke quickly now, though still calmly. "I am offering a legal and social shield before Mr. Fletchley can turn rumour into accepted truth. If Miss Maresfield refuses, I will still send Mr. Halford, the solicitor, to secure the vinaigrette and examine the dowry receipt. I will still contradict any public falsehood I witnessed. Marriage is not the price of my honesty." Emmeline stood. She needed height, even if his rank made height irrelevant. "Do you often propose marriage as a form of evidence preservation?" A flicker crossed his face. "Never before today." "That is reassuring in the smallest possible measure." This time the corner of his mouth did move, but the gravity returned at once. "The settlement would preserve your mother's personal property as yours. Your aunt would review the terms. You would have separate rooms, your own allowance, and no obligation to perform gratitude." Mrs. Alwyn stared at him. "You speak as though drafting a treaty." "Marriage often is one. People merely pretend the lace makes it softer." Emmeline looked toward the open door, where the hall beyond sat quiet and respectable. A proper woman should have been shocked. A romantic woman should have been wounded that the offer contained no declaration. Emmeline found herself steadied by its honesty. Still, she would not step from one man's convenience into another man's command. "If I accepted," she said slowly, "it would not be because I am grateful you noticed me. Good. It would not permit you to lock away my mother's box and tell me later what was inside." His eyes held hers. "No, it would not make me a memorial to your mother." Something in him flinched, so slight most would have missed it. Emmeline did not. "No," he said again, quieter, "and it would not give you the right to speak over me when the scandal becomes uncomfortable." "No." Mrs. Alwyn sank back into her chair, her expression caught between alarm and reluctant approval. Emmeline drew one breath, then another. "I will not answer today. I did not ask you to. You asked me to marry you. I asked you to consider whether my name may be of use before theirs is used against you. Those are not the same thing." She looked at the vinaigrette. The bent lid had shifted slightly. Within the damaged seam, A sliver of darkness showed beneath the lining. Her mother's secret, if it was a secret, waited without impatience. Dead women had patience. Living women could not always afford it. "I will consider until morning," Emmeline said. "You may send Mr. Halford after breakfast. Mrs. Alwyn will receive him." The Duke rose. "Thank you. Do not thank me yet. Then I will wait to earn that as well." He bowed to Mrs. Alwyn, then to Emmeline, and turned toward the door. At the threshold he paused. "Miss Maresfield." She looked up. "I did not choose you because he left you." His voice was steady, but something beneath it was not. "I chose you because he feared what you might still hold." He left before she could answer. A moment later, the front door closed, and the room seemed smaller without him. Mrs. Alwyn sat very still. "My dear," she said at last, "your mother once served on the same charity committee as the late Duchess of Briarcliff. I never understood why she burned so many drafts and kept so few fair copies." Emmeline looked at the broken silver box on the table. It rattled once more, faintly, as the fire settled. "Perhaps," she said. She kept the one that mattered. By 9 o'clock the next morning, Emmeline Maresfield had discovered that deciding to marry a feared duke required less romance than choosing a bonnet and more courage than facing a room full of whispers. The decision itself had come before dawn, while Mrs. Alwyn slept, and the house in Half Moon Street held the grey silence peculiar to London mornings before the tradesmen began their calls. Emmeline had sat at the small writing desk with her mother's damaged vinaigrette before her, its lid crooked, its lavender sprig dented, its hidden rattle waiting like a secret with folded hands. She had tried to imagine refusing. Refusal had a clean dignity to it. She could retreat with Mrs. Alwyn, endure the gossip, let Tobias Fletchley marry Lady Marcella Quince, and spend the rest of the season being spoken of as the poor girl who had nearly caught a husband, but not quite. Yet every version of refusal ended with someone else holding the pen. Tobias would write her as grasping. Marcella would write her as inferior. Lady Quince would write her mother as careless with accounts. Society would copy whatever version sounded prettiest over tea. At 6 o'clock, Emmeline had taken out a sheet of paper and written only one sentence to the Duke of Briarcliff. "I will accept your name, provided I do not lose my own truth inside it." His reply arrived before 8, delivered by a sober footman who behaved as if carrying a treaty between nations. The Duke's answer was equally brief. "You shall not. Mr. Halford will attend us at 10. By noon, the special license had been arranged through channels. Emmeline did not pretend to understand, though Mrs. Alwyn read every settlement term with spectacles low on her nose and suspicion high in both eyes. By 2, Emmeline stood inside the vestry of St. George's, Hanover Square, wearing a dove-grey gown that had been intended for winter calls, not marriage. It was not bridal. That steadied her. She did not want lace, pretending this was a dream. The church smelled faintly of cold stone, beeswax, and damp wool. Outside carriage wheels passed and paused, for news had begun to run ahead of propriety. Inside, the witnesses were few. Mrs. Alwyn stood at Emmeline's left, lips pressed thin with worry. Mr. Halford, a narrow gentleman with silver hair and an ink-stained forefinger, guarded a leather portfolio as though scandal might leap from it if he blinked. The Duke of Briarcliff waited near the altar rail in a dark morning coat, severe as judgment and still as the carved stone behind him. He turned when Emmeline entered. He did not smile. Strangely, that comforted her. A smile would have made the day false. His gaze moved over her face, then to the small silk reticule at her wrist where the crushed vinaigrette rested wrapped in linen. He saw that she had kept it. He gave the slightest inclination of his head, a gesture almost imperceptible, yet it said more than flattery. He understood possession. He understood proof. He understood that what had belonged to her mother would not pass into male custody merely because men had begun to fear it. "Miss Maresfield," he said quietly when she reached him. "Your Grace." Mrs. Alwine made a small sound, for perhaps another quarter hour. Emmeline looked at the Duke then, and to her surprise the corner of his mouth moved. "Your aunt is exact." "Painfully," Emmeline said. "Usually for my benefit, then I owe her attention." He turned to Mrs. Alwine with grave courtesy. "Madam, the settlement has been read, twice, and objected to, frequently, corrected, sufficiently. Then I am in your debt." Mrs. Alwine's expression softened by no more than a thread. "Do not acquire another one today, Your Grace." Before he could answer, a disturbance rose outside the church doors. A man's voice, too polished to be honest, carried through the vestibule. "I have a right to speak to Miss Maresfield before she ruins herself." Emmeline's hand tightened around the reticule. She knew that voice. Tobias had always believed doors were intended for other people. Mr. Halford stepped toward the vestry entrance, but the Duke lifted one hand. Not a dramatic command. A pause. "Ask him whether he comes as a witness, a creditor, or a disappointed gentleman," Philip said to the verger. The verger, pale with the importance of resisting scandal, disappeared. Tobias entered without permission a moment later. He had dressed carefully, which made the fury in his face more ugly. His cravat was perfect. His eyes were not. "Emmeline," he said, using her Christian name as if intimacy could be reclaimed by insolence. "Don't do this. You don't understand what he wants." The Duke did not move. That restraint frightened Tobias more than anger would have. Emmeline felt it and found her own breath. "You forfeited the right to advise me yesterday." Tobias gave a short laugh. "I tried to spare you. Now you mean to parade yourself as a duchess, because your pride was pricked in public." "No," she said. "I mean to stand where your version of me cannot reach first." His mouth tightened. "You think a duke's name will save you? It will only make the fall higher when he learns what your mother left behind." The words struck too close. Mrs. Alwine stiffened. Mr. Halford's eyes narrowed. The Duke spoke at last. "That is the second time you have shown concern for Mrs. Maresfield's papers, Mr. Fletchley." Tobias realized his mistake. Emmeline saw it in the way his gaze slid toward the reticule and away again. He covered it quickly. A gentleman may object when his former fiancée rushes into a marriage designed to provoke him. "You flatter yourself," Emmeline said. Her voice was not loud, but the church carried it cleanly. "This marriage is not revenge. Revenge would require me to care where you stand after I leave." The silence that followed was almost merciful. Tobias's face darkened. "You will regret humiliating me." Philip stepped one pace forward then. Only one. It changed the air. "Miss Maresfield has not humiliated you. She has described you accurately. Leave before I am required to add detail." Tobias looked at him, then at Emmeline, as if seeking the weaker door. He found none. He bowed with a stiffness that made the gesture an insult and left the church. Only when the outer door closed did Mrs. Alwine exhale. Emmeline realized she had not trembled. The knowledge did not make her brave. It made her present. Philip turned to her. "Do you wish to delay?" She looked toward the altar rail, then down at the reticule where her mother's broken silver box pressed against her wrist. If she delayed, Tobias would still speak. Marcella would still smile. Lady Quince would still arrange pity into a weapon. The world would not become kinder because Emmeline hesitated before entering it. "No," she said, "I wish to choose before anyone else mistakes me for something abandoned." For the first time, the Duke's face changed openly. Respect moved through his stern features like light through a shutter. "Then we proceed." The ceremony was brief, though Emmeline would remember it afterward as a series of bright fragments. The clergyman's voice, Mrs. Alwine's handkerchief clenched in one fist, the cold band of air beneath the church door. Philip's voice, low and steady, making vows that sounded less like poetry than law, and therefore oddly more reliable. When Emmeline spoke her own vows, she did not think of love. Love belonged to girls who had not been taught how quickly a promise could become a public instrument. She thought of truth. She thought of her mother's ink-stained fingers. She thought of the crushed hinge of the vinaigrette and the narrow sound inside it. When the ring touched her finger, Philip did not press or linger. He placed it with formal care, as if even that small contact required respect. She gave him her hand because the rite required it, and because she chose not to flinch. By the time they stepped outside, the afternoon had turned pale and sharp. A few curious carriages had slowed near the square. News would fly before dinner. Fletchley would say she had married in pique. Marcella would say pity had won a coronet. Emmeline gathered her cloak and descended the steps beside the Duke of Briarcliff without lowering her head. His carriage waited, black lacquer, dark horses, liveried footmen. A vehicle built for consequence. As the footman opened the door, Philip paused. "Your aunt will follow with Mr. Halford. You may ride with her if you prefer." Emmeline looked at him. "You are offering your carriage and an escape from it in the same breath. Both should be available. Does that principle extend to marriage? It must, or the marriage is only a prettier form of captivity." The answer passed through her defenses with unnerving precision. She stepped into the carriage. Philip entered after her and sat opposite, leaving the space beside her untouched. For several minutes, neither spoke. London moved around them in muffled sounds, hooves on stone, vendors calling, the faint grind of wheels through damp streets. Emmeline loosened the strings of her reticule to assure herself the vinaigrette was safe. The carriage turned. The reticule slipped from her lap. Philip reached at the same instant she did. Their fingers met around the linen-wrapped silver box. It was no more than a brush of skin, brief, accidental, yet both of them stilled. His hand was warm, steady, and immediately withdrawn, not snatched away, not claimed, simply removed, so that she might hold what was hers. Emmeline drew the reticule back into her lap. Her pulse had altered in a way that had nothing to do with fear. Philip looked toward the window, giving her the courtesy of not watching her notice it. "One day," he said quietly, "I will tell you why the name Maresfield stopped me at the door." She held the damaged vinaigrette through the linen, "and one day I will decide whether I forgive you for making that sound like a threat and a kindness at once." This time he did smile faintly. It was gone almost before it existed. "That is fair." The carriage turned toward Briarcliff House. Emmeline looked out at the grey sweep of Mayfair and saw, reflected faintly in the glass, not the abandoned fiancé Tobias had tried to leave behind, but a woman seated across from a feared duke, carrying her mother's broken silver box into a house full of locked answers. She had married without mercy. She had married without love, but she had not married without choice. Briarcliff House did not look like a home awaiting a bride. It looked like a verdict built in Portland stone. The carriage drew up before a broad Mayfair, frontage just as the afternoon light thinned to pewter, and Emmeline saw tall windows reflecting a sky without warmth, black railings polished to a severe shine, and a door so dark it seemed to have been painted with old silence. No garlands hung there, no curious footman smiled, no female relative waited on the steps with outstretched hands and false delight. The house received her as society had received the marriage itself, with attention sharpened by disbelief. Philip descended first. He did not offer his hand at once. He stood beside the open carriage door, looked up at her, and waited until she shifted forward of her own will. Only then did he raise his gloved hand, palm steady, not reaching into the carriage, but making assistance available. Emmeline accepted because the step was high and because refusal, when made only to prove independence, could become another kind of performance. His grip lasted the length of one breath, firm, careful, gone. The brief contact left no claim behind it, and that unsettled her more than possession would have done. She stepped onto the pavement, as Duchess of Briarcliff, with her mother's damaged vinaigrette in her reticule, and Tobias Fletchley's warning still cold at the edge of memory. The door opened before they reached it. A butler of composed years stood inside, flanked by 2 footmen and a housekeeper in black silk. Their bows and curtsies were exact, not warm. Exactness, Emmeline was beginning to learn, could be a very elegant form of fear. "Your Grace," the butler said to Philip. Then he turned to Emmeline with the smallest hesitation, almost invisible, except that the whole day had trained her to notice hesitations. "Your Grace." The title touched her strangely. It did not fit yet. It hung around her like a borrowed mantle, heavy with other women's ghosts. Philip heard the hesitation too. "Her Grace is mistress of this house," he said. "All household matters are to be referred to her as they would have been to me." The housekeeper's eyes flicked upward, startled despite her training. "Yes, Your Grace. Mrs. Vale will show you the rooms prepared for you," Philip said to Emmeline. "They are your own. No door in this house is locked to you except one file cabinet in my study, and that only because Mr. Halford has sealed it until witnesses may be present." "A file cabinet?" she asked. "Charity papers." He lowered his voice. "Not hidden from you, preserved from interference." She looked at him. "That is a narrow distinction. Then I will make certain it remains visible." Before she could answer, Mrs. Vale stepped forward. She was a handsome woman of perhaps 50, with grey threaded through dark hair, and an expression that had learned obedience at the cost of curiosity. "If your Grace will come this way." Emmeline followed her beneath a marble arch and into a hall lined with portraits. The air smelled faintly of wax, coal smoke, and something older, like lavender sealed too long in linen. She stopped before the largest portrait on the first landing. A lady in white satin stood beside a stone urn, one hand resting lightly at her bodice, where a small lavender sprig had been pinned. Her face was lovely, but not soft. There was intelligence in the eyes and something nearly defiant in the set of the mouth. Emmeline's fingers moved to her reticule before she could prevent them. "The late Duchess, Mrs. Vale's face tightened. "Yes, Your Grace. Her Grace, the late Duchess Helena St. Aldren." Philip had paused 3 steps below. "My mother." He spoke without sentiment, yet the lack of it felt like a door locked from inside. Emmeline looked again at the painted lavender. She wore the same flower. "Many ladies wore lavender," Mrs. Vale said too quickly. Philip's gaze moved to the housekeeper, but not many used it as a mark. Mrs. Vale bowed her head. "No, Your Grace." The silence that followed was thin and strained. Emmeline sensed servants listening beyond closed doors, the house holding its breath around old knowledge. She did not ask more, not yet. A woman arriving on her wedding day with scandal in her wake and a crushed silver box in her reticule could not demand every ghost answer at once. Mrs. Vale led her to a suite overlooking the square. It contained a bedchamber, a dressing room, and a small sitting room where a fire had been lit late and hurriedly. The flames still struggled in the grate. On the writing desk lay fresh paper, sealing wax, and a silver key ring. Emmeline looked at it. "These are for me," Mrs. Vale curtsied. His Grace ordered them set out. "All of them, the household keys, Your Grace, except the strong room, His Grace's private dispatch box, and the sealed cabinet mentioned below." A week ago, Emmeline had owned little that could not fit into 2 trunks and a memory. Now an entire house waited to see whether she would be timid with authority or vulgar with it. She lifted the keys. They were colder than she expected. "Thank you, Mrs. Vale. I will not make changes today. The servants have had enough surprise." The housekeeper blinked. "Very good, Your Grace. But I would like tomorrow's account books brought after breakfast, with the cook's household list and the coal tallies." Mrs. Vale's surprise deepened. Emmeline let the keys rest in her palm. A house is warmer when one knows where the coal goes. Mrs. Vale's curtsy this time held something closer to respect. "Yes, Your Grace." The woman had scarcely left when a card arrived on a silver tray. Philip was still in the doorway, not entering without invitation. Emmeline read the card and felt the day sharpen again. Lady Marcella Quince. "That was quick," she said. Philip's expression hardened. "Improperly quick. You need not receive her. If I refuse, she will say I am hiding. If you receive her, she will try to wound you. Then at least the wound will reveal the knife." His eyes held hers. "Do you wish me present?" The easy answer was yes. The wiser answer was not entirely. "Near enough that she remembers whose house this is. Not so near that she can pretend I required rescue." A pause. Then Philip bowed his head. "As you wish." The words were simple. They made the room feel less like a prison. Lady Marcella entered the blue drawing room 15 minutes later in plum silk and sympathy arranged like jewelry. Her mother had not come. That omission was insult enough. A single unmarried lady paying such a call to a newly married duchess on the wedding day without proper interval or full ceremony was either ignorant or deliberate. Marcella was not ignorant. Emmeline received her seated, because a duchess could. Philip stood near the mantel, not beside Emmeline, not before her, but within sight. Marcella curtsied beautifully. "Your Grace, I hope you'll forgive the intrusion. I was so anxious after yesterday's distress." "How kind," Emmeline said. "Most people wait at least a day before dressing curiosity as concern." Marcella's smile tightened. "You must be overwhelmed. A broken engagement, an unexpected marriage, a house of this consequence. One hopes His Grace has explained enough to prevent confusion." Philip's gaze cooled. Emmeline answered before he could. "His Grace has explained what belongs to him to explain." "And what does not?" Marcella asked softly. "I ask questions." A small silence opened. Marcella glanced toward the writing table, where Emmeline had placed the reticule beside the keys. "How fortunate that your little silver keepsake survived." Mr. Fletchley was horrified when he heard it had been damaged. Was he? Men can be clumsy when distressed. Yes, some become clumsy with objects, others with truth. Philip turned his face slightly toward the fire. Emmeline had the absurd impression he was concealing satisfaction. Marcella saw enough to dislike it. "You are braver than I expected." "No," Emmeline said. only less grateful than you hoped. The color in Marcella's cheeks rose delicately. I hope you will not discover too late that His Grace's interest was not in you, but in an old debt. The room seemed to still around Philip. Emmeline felt the words land exactly where Marcella had aimed them. The fear had already been there. Was she a woman or a repayment? A wife or an answer to a dead scandal? She folded her hands in her lap, so the mark on her wrist would not show. Lady Marcella, she said, if His Grace married me because of old guilt, then it is still a better reason than marrying a man because his creditors are impatient. Marcella stood. The movement was too sudden to be graceful. I see marriage has improved your confidence. No, it has improved my address. Emmeline let the pause settle, then rang the bell. Mrs. Vale will see you out. Philip did not speak until Marcella had gone, and the front door had closed below with a firmness that sounded almost human. Then he turned from the mantel. You did not need my help. I needed your silence. That is not something people usually value in me. Perhaps they have not used it properly. His expression changed, not into amusement, not quite, something quieter. Your cloak, he said. Only then did she realize she still wore it. The ribbons half loosened, the room too warm around her. The footman who should have taken it had frozen during Marcella's arrival and never returned. Philip stepped closer, then stopped with one hand lifted but not touching the cloth. May I? Emmeline looked at his hand, at the controlled patience in it. After a day of being grabbed, arranged, judged, and married, that pause felt almost intimate. She nodded. Yes. He moved behind her with care, loosening the cloak from her shoulders without brushing her neck. Still, she felt the nearness of him in the warmed air, in the faint scent of wool and rain and clean starch. When the cloak fell away, she stood lighter, not safe, not yet, but less alone. He folded the garment over his arm as though it were not beneath a duke's dignity to carry what she had chosen to remove. This is your house now, he said. Emmeline looked at the keys on the table, the reticule beside them, and the portrait of his mother waiting somewhere above with lavender pinned to her painted breast. Then tomorrow, she said, I would like to begin with the accounts. Philip's eyes darkened with recognition. So would your mother have done. The vinaigrette rattled faintly in the reticule, as if the broken thing had heard them both. By breakfast the next morning, Emmeline had learned that a duchess could command 3 coal ledgers, 2 household account books, and 1 trembling junior footman merely by asking for them in a voice that did not rise. The discovery did not make her feel powerful. It made her feel watched. Briarcliff House had changed its manner overnight. The servants no longer stared openly, but their obedience had become alert, as if every request she made might reveal whether she intended to be a tyrant, an ornament, or a woman who knew the price of candles. Emmeline sat in the small morning room with the account books arranged before her, a pot of tea cooling at her elbow and her mother's damaged vinaigrette resting on a folded square of linen near the inkstand. The scrape on her wrist had faded to a faint shadow, yellowing at the edge, but the silver box still looked freshly wounded. Its hinge gaped slightly. Whenever the table shifted, something inside gave that delicate, infuriating rattle. She had resisted the impulse to pry at it with a hairpin. Her mother had not raised a daughter to destroy evidence through impatience. Mrs. Vale had delivered the household lists with an expression of disciplined curiosity, and then withdrawn. Now only Philip stood across the room near the window, reading a note brought by hand from Mr. Halford. He had not joined her at the table. That distance was deliberate, she thought. He left the books before her, as if the authority truly belonged there. Still, the sealed charity file lay in a black dispatch case on the sideboard, and that single locked object drew her attention more strongly than every open ledger. "You look at that case as though it has insulted you," Philip said without lifting his eyes from the note. "It has not yet been introduced properly enough to insult me. Mr. Halford asks that it remain sealed until he arrives this afternoon." "Mr. Halford is not my husband." His gaze rose. The word husband altered the air between them. Not warmly, not yet, but with unmistakable force. They had been married less than a day. The vows still felt like ink drying in a room too cold for flowers. "No," he said. "He is the solicitor attempting to keep both our families from being devoured by old paper. Paper has an appetite. In London, paper has ruined more women than swords." Emmeline looked back at the household coal list. "Then I prefer to know which sheets are hungry." He folded the note and came nearer, stopping at the opposite side of the table. "That is why I asked him here, and why you have not told me everything yourself." The question had been waiting since dawn. It had sat with her while she read coal tallies, watched Mrs. Vale's controlled surprise, and noticed that one file cabinet in the study was locked by witness seal. Philip rested one hand on the back of a chair, but did not sit. He looked older in the morning light, not weary in body, but in memory. The scar near his temple appeared paler, a fine line left by something no servant would mention. Because some things told without proof become another kind of rumor. That is a careful answer. It is also an incomplete one, I noticed. For a moment, something like rueful respect passed across his face. "Your mother would have made me deeply uncomfortable. She made most dishonest people deeply uncomfortable." Then she was consistent. He drew the chair back and sat, not at the head of the table, across from her. "Years ago, my mother served as patroness to 3 small funds: Widow's Coal, Poor Children's Boots, a convalescent broth subscription in Spitalfields. She was not beloved by the committee because she insisted upon seeing receipts. Women are praised for charity until they ask where the money went." Emmeline's fingers tightened around her pen. "My mother said a missing shilling had a face somewhere." Philip closed his eyes briefly. The movement was so quick she might have missed it if she had not been looking at him. "Yes, those words were in my mother's last letter." The room fell still. Outside the window, a delivery cart rattled down the square. Inside, the past stepped nearer. "What happened?" Emmeline asked. Money vanished, not all at once, small sums, enough to be dismissed by gentlemen as bad copying, enough to buy silence from the practical, enough to make the poor colder while the committee remained elegant. My mother discovered it. Then she was accused of confusion, vanity, and interference. The phrase used was nervous mismanagement. His mouth hardened. A useful phrase. It sounds kinder than fraud and crueler than grief. Emmeline saw the portrait on the landing in her mind, lavender pinned at the bodice, eyes clear and defiant beneath painted calm. Did your mother defend herself? Until defending herself became proof that she was unstable. There was no self-pity in his voice. That made the pain worse. My father wanted the scandal quiet. Lady Quince's circle wanted it buried. The committee wanted the subscriptions to continue without embarrassment. Then Mrs. Maresfield produced duplicate accounts. She had copied them before the books were altered. Emmeline's breath caught. My mother did that? She saved my mother's name from formal disgrace. Not publicly, not enough, but enough that the accusation was never entered where it could not be removed. He looked at the vinaigrette. She also wrote that if anything happened to her, the lavender mark should be remembered. Emmeline stared at the small silver box. The dented sprig was no longer merely decoration. It was a door. Why did no one tell me? I do not know. That is not an answer. It is the only honest one I possess. He leaned back, his restraint visibly tightening around him. Mrs. Maresfield died within the year. My mother died before the matter could be made right. My father locked away what remained and called silence dignity. I was 18, angry, and told I understood nothing of society. Perhaps I did not, but I understood. My mother had been made smaller by people who smiled while doing it. The bitterness in his voice was quiet, but it had roots. Emmeline did not think. She reached across the table and touched his wrist. It was a small gesture, 2 fingers resting lightly against the edge of his cuff, where his hand gripped the chair. The moment she did it, she became aware of everything. The warmth beneath black wool, the stillness that seized him, the fact that she had chosen the contact before knowing whether he would welcome it. She almost withdrew at once, but he did not move away. His eyes lowered to her hand, then lifted to her face. There was surprise there. Not triumph, not possession. Surprise and something more vulnerable than a feared duke should have allowed any woman to see after one day of marriage. I am sorry, she said. For your mother. His voice changed. Do not be sorry because gratitude demands it. It does not. Do not be kind because I have given you my name. I am not. Her fingers remained a breath longer, then she withdrew them of her own will. I am kind because you just sounded like a son, not a duke. He looked away first. That, more than anything, told her she had reached something unguarded. I have feared gratitude, he said after a moment, because it can become a prison. My mother was grateful to committees that tolerated her. My father was grateful to society for burying what it should have corrected. I did not want you to wake in this house and discover you had been placed inside another woman's memorial. Emmeline looked down at the vinaigrette. And yet you chose me first because of my mother. Yes, the honesty struck cleanly. At first I chose your name. Then I saw you standing in that room, while Fletchley tried to make abandonment look like mercy. I saw you refuse to let him write you. That was not your mother, that was you. Her throat tightened, but she would not soften too quickly. Women were too often trained to mistake explanation for safety. Then hear me clearly. I will not be used to settle a debt between ghosts. No, I will not have my mother's object locked away while men discuss what it means. No, and if there is truth inside that box, I will see it when you do. Yes, the answer was immediate. She believed the word. She was not yet certain she believed the world around it. A knock interrupted them. Mrs. Vale entered with a silver salver, and upon it lay a folded note. For her grace, delivered by hand from Mr. Fletchley's lodgings. Philip's expression chilled, but he did not reach for it. Emmeline noticed. She took the note herself. The handwriting was Tobias's, sharp with annoyance. She broke the seal and read aloud. Because secrecy had already done enough damage, the silver article in your possession formed part of the understanding between our families, and must be returned before further embarrassment results. I advise you not to mistake His Grace's temporary interest for permanent safety. Mrs. Vale went pale. Philip's hand closed once, then opened. He wants the vinaigrette. Emmeline placed the note beside the silver box. No, he wants whatever he fears is hidden inside it. As if answering him, the damaged lining shifted with a faint click, a narrow slip of paper loosened by the broken hinge and the warmth of the room, edged into view beneath the inner grille. Emmeline did not touch it until Philip had moved around the table where both of them could see. He took off his gloves and set them aside as he had done the day before, making no claim to the object. Emmeline lifted the bent lid. With the tip of her penknife, she eased out the folded slip. The paper was small, browned at the edge, and covered in her mother's fine, disciplined hand. Only one line could be read without unfolding it further. QC, duplicate receipt concealed. Philip's face went utterly still. Emmeline looked from the initials to the Fletchley note, then to the sealed dispatch case across the room. "Quince Committee," she asked. "Or Quince Charity," he said. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The household fire cracked softly. On the table, the crushed silver vinaigrette lay open at last, and Emmeline felt the past breathing through the break Tobias had made. Then another knock came, sharper this time. Mrs. Vale returned almost at once, shaken past formality. "Your Grace, Mr. Halford sends word. The charity treasurer's duplicate book has disappeared." Philip rose slowly. Emmeline folded the slip with care and kept it beneath her palm. "Then we are no longer looking only at the past," she said. "No," Philip answered, his eyes on hers. "We are looking at who feared your mother enough to fear you." The invitation to return to the Queen's Crescent subscription rooms arrived on cream paper edged in grey, as if even the stationery wished to appear charitable while preparing an execution. Emmeline read it, standing beside the morning room window at Briarcliff House, the paper held in one hand and her mother's silver vinaigrette resting open on the table behind her. 3 days had passed since Mr. Halford's message that the duplicate charity book had disappeared. In those 3 days, London had done what London did best. It had taken a woman's wound, trimmed away the blood, and turned the remainder into conversation. By Monday, Emmeline had not been abandoned but exposed. By Tuesday, she had not been married but rescued. By Wednesday, according to a note Mrs. Alwine had brought with a face like thunder, she had used the Duke of Briarcliff's name to solicit pledges for the widow's coal fund before their marriage was even known. The accusation was absurd. That did not make it harmless. Absurdity wore silk very well in Mayfair. Philip stood across the room with Mr. Halford near the hearth, both men studying the false invitation list that had been delivered with the cream paper. He had not reached for the note in Emmeline's hand. Since the morning, she had touched his wrist and drawn the first fragile thread between grief and trust. He had become more careful, not less. Careful men could still wound. She knew that, yet his restraint had begun to feel less like distance and more like a promise he was trying to learn how to keep. "Lady Quince requests my presence at the Patroness Review meeting," Emmeline said. "Requests?" Mrs. Alwine repeated from the sofa. "A spider requests the fly to inspect the parlour." Mr. Halford gave a dry cough that might have concealed amusement. Philip did not smile. "You do not have to attend." Emmeline turned from the window. "If I do not attend, she will say I feared examination. If you do attend, she will stage 1. Then we shall save her the trouble of sending invitations twice." Philip's eyes lifted to hers. Emmeline. It was the first time he had used her Christian name outside necessity. The room seemed to notice. Mrs. Alwyn looked down at her gloves. Mr. Halford found sudden interest in the fold of his papers. Emmeline felt the name as a soft pressure beneath her ribs, not intimate enough to be improper between husband and wife, yet not empty enough to be ignored. "Your Grace," she answered, because courage sometimes required a small shield of formality. His gaze held. "I can contradict any accusation I witnessed. I can secure the papers. I can require the counterfoil if they produce one, to remain in Mr. Halford's custody. But I cannot prevent every whisper from entering the room. No, she said, but I can prevent them from being the only sound. That settled it. 2 hours later, the Briarcliff carriage stopped before the Queen's Crescent subscription rooms, where the same windows admitted, the same grey afternoon light, and the same long table stood beneath the chandeliers. Emmeline's hand tightened for one moment around the reticule at her wrist. Inside it lay the damaged vinaigrette, wrapped in linen, and the narrow paper slip marked in her mother's hand. QC's, duplicate receipt concealed. She had not surrendered either to Philip. He had not asked. As the footman opened the carriage door, Philip stepped down first and turned back. His arm was not immediately offered. He waited, as he had waited from the beginning, until she moved. "There will be eyes," he said quietly. "There were eyes when I had less rank and more illusion. That is not comfort. No, but it's true." His mouth softened, barely. "Will you permit me to walk in with you?" Emmeline looked past him to the entrance, where 2 ladies had already paused to watch. "Not before me." "Never." He offered his arm then, formal, visible, and not possessive. Emmeline took it after she had placed her own foot on the pavement. The gesture lasted only the distance from carriage to door, but the heat of his sleeve beneath her glove steadied something she would not have admitted aloud. Inside, the room altered at once. Conversation thinned. Lady Quince sat at the head of the table, dignity arranged in black silk. Lady Marcella stood behind her chair in lavender muslin, a colour chosen either by accident or insolence. Tobias Fletchley was near the mantel, pale and polished, with the expression of a man who had come prepared to be injured publicly. Emmeline felt Philip's arm beneath her hand. He did not move to speak. He let the silence come to her. Lady Quince inclined her head. "Your Grace, Duchess, we are relieved you chose to attend. Matters of charity must be kept above personal embarrassment." "Then we begin with charity," Emmeline said, releasing Philip's arm and stepping to the table. "Not embarrassment." Marcella's smile flickered. The treasurer, poor Mr. Barrow, with ink forever near his cuffs, rose and stammered through the business of the fund. Coal deliveries were delayed. Certain pledges had become uncertain. Public confidence, he said, had been disturbed. Then Marcella moved. She did it beautifully, with reluctance shaped into grace. "It pains me to speak, but silence would be unfair to the widows, depending upon this committee." Emmeline watched her draw a narrow paper from a folio. "A counterfoil has been found. It records a substantial pledge entered under Briarcliff authority on the morning before the Duke's marriage was known. The initials appear to be those of Her Grace, then Miss Maresfield." The paper crossed the table from hand to hand. Each lady looked at it as if fraud had a smell only virtue could detect. Tobias lowered his gaze with exquisite regret. "I never wished Miss Maresfield's ambition to become public. I tried to end matters gently." Philip moved so slightly that only Emmeline, standing near him, sensed the check in his body. He wanted to speak. He did not. She was grateful and unexpectedly proud of him for the effort. Lady Quince sighed. "A young woman in reduced circumstances may be tempted to secure herself. We are not without compassion." "How generous," Emmeline said, "to accuse me and pardon me before I answer." A few eyes rose. Marcella's expression cooled. "Do you deny the initials? I deny the hand. I deny the pledge. I deny the assumption that a woman who records charity must be stealing warmth for herself." Mr. Barrow slid the counterfoil toward her with trembling fingers. Emmeline did not touch it at first. She bent just enough to look. The letters EM had been copied with care, but not with knowledge. Her own M had a narrow central valley, inherited from her mother's hand. This M was round and lazy. More important, the paper carried a scent. Not coal dust, not ink gum, not the faint vinegar lavender sharpness of her mother's vinaigrette. This was sweeter, powdery, deliberate, lavender blurred with violet. Emmeline looked up at Marcella. How curious. Yes, Marcella said softly. Fourth often is. Then you noticed it too. Marcella paused. Noticed what? Emmeline lifted the counterfoil with the edge of her glove and held it toward Mr. Halford, who had entered quietly behind them with Mrs. Alwine. This paper has not lived on the subscription desk. It smells of a lady's note case. Lady Quince stiffened. Emmeline continued before anyone could interrupt. The coal pledges entered here smell of ink, dust, wool, and the fire. This smells of lavender violet scent, Lady Marcella. Your note yesterday carried the same perfume. The room went very still. Marcella gave a small laugh. Many ladies use lavender. Indeed, my mother did. Emmeline let the words settle. But my mother's lavender was sharpened with vinegar for faintness and fever rooms. Yours is sweetened with violet and orris. It is very pretty. It is also careless, Tobias snapped. You are making a performance from scent. Philip spoke then, only then. Mr. Fletchley, the Duchess is making an observation. The distinction appears to trouble you. Lady Quince's hand struck the table softly, no louder than a folded fan. This is indecorous. So was my abandonment, Emmeline said, yet this room endured it. Mrs. Alwine made a sound that might have been approval disguised as a cough. Mr. Halford stepped forward. With the committee's permission, I will retain the counterfoil until its paper and stationer may be verified. Absolutely not, Lady Quince said. Philip's voice lowered. Absolutely yes. He did not raise it. He did not need to. A public accusation has been made before witnesses. The evidence will not vanish as conveniently as the duplicate book. Mr. Barrow flinched. Marcella's eyes flashed once toward him, quick as a blade. Emmeline saw it. So did Philip. He looked at Emmeline, not to command, but to ask without words whether she had seen enough. She had. Yet her voice remained level. I came here because I was told Charity had been disturbed. I find instead that Charity has been dressed as a trap. You may suspend my name from the list, if it pleases you, but do not pretend that removing my name restores the coal. The oldest patroness at the far end of the table, Lady Pennick, shifted in her chair. That is a fair point. Lady Quince turned on her. My lady. A fair point, Lady Pennick repeated, and age made her disobedience respectable. Marcella gathered the folio to her breast. No one wishes to harm you, Duchess, but surely you understand that your sudden rise invites questions. Emmeline looked at Tobias, then at the table where the false counterfoil lay between Charity and Malice. My rise was not sudden. It was simply the first part of my life you chose to notice. Philip offered his arm again. Not to remove her, not to silence her, to stand with her after she had spoken. Emmeline looked at it, then at him. The room watched for weakness. She gave them choice instead. She placed her hand on his sleeve. Mr. Halford, Philip said, secure the counterfoil. Mr. Halford did. No one stopped him. As they left the room, Emmeline heard the whispers begin behind her. Altered now, uncertain where to land. At the threshold, Philip leaned just near enough for her alone to hear. Her word is not weaker because it is quiet. Emmeline kept her gaze forward, but her hand remained on his arm until they reached the carriage. Behind them, in the room where she had once been discarded, something far more dangerous than pity had begun. Doubt had changed sides. The rumour reached Briarcliff House before the carriage wheels had fully dried from the street. It arrived first as a footman's averted eyes, then as Mrs. Vale's stiffened mouth, then as a folded gossip sheet placed on Philip's study desk by a secretary who had the good sense to look ashamed of paper. Emmeline stood near the window of the blue morning room, her gloves still on, the faint pressure of Philip's arm lingering beneath her fingertips from the walk out of the subscription rooms. She had spoken. She had not collapsed. She had seen doubt change sides. For one impossible hour that had felt like progress. Then Mrs. Vale entered with the household post, and one card fell face up upon the salver. Lady Marcella Quince regretted that Her Grace's recent distress had made public charity difficult for everyone concerned. Beneath the sweetness of the phrase lay the knife. By evening, half of Mayfair would hear that the Duchess of Briarcliff had been escorted from the patroness meeting under suspicion. By breakfast, perhaps, they would decide she had fled it. Emmeline removed her gloves slowly and placed them beside her mother's vinaigrette, which lay wrapped in linen upon the table. The damaged hinge had not worsened. The dent remained. The hidden slip was folded safely in the small morocco case. Philip had provided, but the vinaigrette itself stayed with her. That had been agreed. No object of her mother's would vanish into a gentleman's drawer, however well guarded. Her Grace should rest, Mrs. Vale said too carefully. Her Grace should eat. Mrs. Alwine added from her chair by the fire, where she had taken refuge after declaring that patronesses were often less charitable than pickpockets. Her Grace, Emmeline said, would like to know why the house has gone quiet. Mrs. Vale hesitated. Philip answered from the doorway, because Lady Marcella is already saying you left the meeting in confusion. Emmeline turned. He held a paper in one hand. His face had settled into the terrible calm society feared in him, but she knew enough now to see the strain beneath it. The difference mattered. It did not comfort her entirely. And did I? She asked. No. Then why does the house believe the lie has weight? Because lies often arrive before correction has its boots on. Mrs. Alwine muttered. Then correction should dress faster. Philip came into the room but did not sit. Mr. Halford has the counterfoil. He will examine the paper and stationer's mark. Mr. Barrow, the treasurer, has agreed to meet privately tomorrow. There is also another matter. Emmeline heard it at once. The carefulness, the slight closing of a door before she had been shown what lay behind it. What matter? His eyes moved toward Mrs. Vale, then to Mrs. Alwine. A sealed instruction was found among my secretary's outgoing papers. It ordered all correspondence from Lady Quince's household to be intercepted for the Duchess's safety. Mrs. Alwine sat forward. You ordered such a thing? No. Emmeline's breath eased, then tightened again, because Philip had not finished. But I learned of it after we returned and chose not to disturb you until I had spoken with Mr. Halford. The room seemed to narrow. You chose not to disturb me, Emmeline repeated. I intended to prevent panic before we knew whether the instruction was genuine. Panic? His jaw set. That was poorly said. It was clearly said. She stepped closer to the table and placed one hand on the linen-wrapped vinaigrette. The instruction concerned my safety, my name, my correspondence, my enemies, and you decided I would learn of it after the gentleman had determined whether I could bear it. No, the word came too quickly. That was not my thought. Then what was it? Philip looked at her. For a moment the mask of the Duke held. Then something human moved behind it, something trained by old grief and bad examples. My thought was that if the Quince household has a hand inside mine, I should close the breach before it reaches you. It had reached me before you read the paper. Emmeline. Do not. The name, which had warmed her in the carriage that morning, now struck too near. Do not make tenderness out of exclusion. He went still. Mrs. Vale lowered her eyes. Mrs. Alwine did not intervene. Perhaps she understood that this was not a quarrel over a letter. It was a trial of the shape their marriage would take. Philip folded the paper once and placed it on the table. Read it now. Yes, after you have decided I may. The flinch was small, but visible. You are right. The admission fell cleanly. It should have soothed her. It did not. Not yet. Emmeline took the paper. The handwriting was not Philip's. It imitated the formal phrasing of a ducal office, cold and efficient. All letters from Quince House, Quince servants, or affiliated tradesmen touching upon her Grace are to be intercepted and delivered unopened to the private study until further instruction. For her Grace's safety, no notice is to be given. No notice. The phrase burned more than the order itself. No notice was how women disappeared from rooms while men called it discretion. No notice was how scandal became settled fact before the woman named in it had taken off her gloves. Who found it? Mr. Latham, my secretary, claims it was placed in his dispatch tray among signed household memoranda. He brought it to me when he saw the wording. Claims, she said. You doubt him. I doubt everyone until the chain is clear, except me. Silence, too brief for guilt, too long for comfort. I do not doubt you. But you protected the information from me. Yes, the honesty was worse than a lie because it offered no place to strike. Emmeline folded the paper and set it down beside the vinaigrette. The old silver caught the firelight, dent visible through the linen edge. Then, hear me once, Phillips and Aldren. I was abandoned in a public room because a man thought he could arrange the story before I spoke. I was accused in the same room because a woman thought charity could be turned into a leash. If you hide pieces of my own danger and call it care, you are not different enough from them to be safe. Mrs. Vale made the faintest sound, but Philip did not look away. What do you require? He asked. Not require. Choose. What do you choose? To leave this house tonight. His face changed. No anger, that would have been easier. Pain, swiftly controlled. For where? Mrs. Alwine's. Her aunt stood at once. My carriage can be ordered. Philip's eyes moved to the older lady, then back to Emmeline. You are my wife. This house is yours. A house becomes mine when doors open before decisions are made, not after. He drew one breath. I will not prevent you. You could. Yes, his voice lowered. That is why I will not. The words entered the room and altered it. Emmeline had expected command, perhaps persuasion, perhaps the cool insistence of a duke unused to refusal. Instead, he offered the only apology he was yet capable of giving without making it about himself. He stepped back. The space between them widened. It hurt more than it should have. Mrs. Vale left to order the carriage. Mrs. Alwine gathered her shawl, triumphant and worried in equal measure. Emmeline lifted the vinaigrette and placed it in her reticule with the hidden slip. The object rattled once, faint and stubborn. Philip watched the movement. Take 2 footmen, he said. No, then take 1 outrider at a distance. Philip. He closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, the Duke was gone for a heartbeat, and only the man remained, afraid of repeating a harm he had not meant to commit. I am not asking to command you. I am asking not to let Lady Quince's coachman learn your route unobserved. She considered him. Trust was not restored by 1 corrected sentence, but reason did not cease to be reason because pain stood near it. One outrider, she said, at a distance. He does not report my visitors unless danger is visible. Agreed. The carriage came within the hour. By then, whispers had begun at the area steps. A duchess leaving her husband's house within days of marriage would become a feast for every drawing room from Mayfair to Belgravia. Emmeline knew it. Philip knew it. That knowledge stood between them in the entrance hall, while Mrs. Alwyn waited beneath her bonnet, and Mrs. Vale pretended not to grieve for the household's dignity. Philip moved as if to offer his hand. Emmeline saw the instinct. So did he. He stopped before the gesture became a claim. "Good night, Your Grace," she said. His mouth tightened at the title. "Good night, Duchess." She descended the steps without his assistance. At the carriage door, she looked back once. He stood framed by the dark entrance of Briarcliff House, feared by half of London, obeyed by everyone beneath his roof, and unable, by his own choice, to stop his wife from leaving him. It was the first power he had given her that cost him something. As the carriage pulled away toward Mrs. Alwyn's house, Emmeline held the damaged vinaigrette in her lap and felt no triumph, only the sharp ache of a necessary wound. Behind her, Briarcliff House grew smaller in the dusk. Before her, London waited with fresh lies. But this time, she carried her own evidence, her own name, and the knowledge that protection without choice was only another locked door. Mrs. Alwyn's breakfast room was smaller than any room Emmeline had occupied at Briarcliff House, but it had one advantage no ducal chamber could claim that morning. Every door in it had been opened by her own hand. Grey light pressed against the windows of Half Moon Street, and the city beyond sounded damp, restless, and hungry for scandal. A folded newspaper lay near the toast rack, face down because Mrs. Alwyn had declared it unfit for digestion. Emmeline did not need to read it. She already knew what it would say without saying it plainly. A young duchess had quarrelled with her husband. A charitable committee had been embarrassed. A woman who rose too quickly had perhaps risen by methods no delicate paper would name. Society loved perhaps. It allowed cruelty to wear gloves. Emmeline sat with her mother's silver vinaigrette. On the table before her, the damaged hinge turned toward the light. Beside it lay the narrow slip in Mrs. Maresfield's hand, folded within a small morocco case. She had slept little, though sleep had not been the point of leaving Briarcliff House. She had not left to rest. She had left to prove, first to Philip and then to herself, that she could move before permission arrived. Mrs. Alwyn watched her over a cup of tea. "You look like your mother," when she was about to correct a vicar's arithmetic. Was that often? Often enough that several vicars improved. Emmeline almost smiled. "I am going to Lincoln's Inn." "Yes, I had reached that unhappy conclusion before you did. Mr. Halford must see the slip, the counterfoil sent noted at the meeting, and Tobias's note demanding the silver box. If I wait for men to arrange a safe hour, the truth will be old by the time it learns to walk." Mrs. Alwyn set down her cup. "I will come, you need not. My dear, I did not live to my present age by allowing young women to carry evidence through London while angry gentlemen roam loose and patronesses sharpen their teeth." By 10, they were in Mrs. Alwyn's carriage with the blinds half drawn against curious eyes. Emmeline wore plain dark blue, not mourning, not bridal, not defiant enough to please gossip. The vinaigrette rested inside her reticule, wrapped in linen. She kept one hand over it through the journey, feeling the shape of the dent through cloth. They reached Lincoln's Inn beneath a sky the colour of old pewter. Mr. Halford received them in chambers smelling of dust, sealing wax, and disciplined panic. He looked at the vinaigrette first, then at Emmeline. "Your Grace, I had hoped His Grace would accompany you." "His Grace does not hold my mother's proof." The solicitor's brows moved, just enough to show approval. "Then let us proceed." The next quarter hour was all paper, but not the dead kind men use to bury women. Mr. Holford placed each item in order upon his desk, Tobias's note demanding the silver article, the slip from the damaged lining, Mrs. Maresfield's distinctive hand, the false counterfoil Mr. Halford had secured from the patroness meeting. Emmeline described the scent, the lazy M, Marcella's notepaper, and the missing duplicate book. Mr. Halford listened without interruption. That alone made him superior to half of society. When she finished, he unlocked a drawer and withdrew a sealed memorandum. "Your mother deposited an abstract of charity receipts years ago. It was never opened because the principal book remained officially unchallenged. After the late Duchess died, and Mrs. Maresfield soon after, there was no living woman with enough rank and enough proof to force the matter into daylight. Until now," Mrs. Alwyn said. Mr. Halford looked at Emmeline. "Until now, if Her Grace authorizes it." The word struck differently from Philip's mouth. From Mr. Halford, it was legal. From Philip, it had begun to become moral. "I authorize examination," Emmeline said. "But nothing leaves my knowledge." "Understood." A commotion sounded outside the chamber door. Mr. Halford's clerk murmured. A man answered, with silk over steel. Emmeline knew the voice before the door opened. Tobias Fletchley entered without waiting for invitation. Though he stopped when he saw Mrs. Alwyn, Mr. Halford, and two clerks behind the outer desk. Witnesses made cowards tidy themselves. "Emmeline," he said, "don't be foolish. That vinaigrette was part of the understanding between our families. You cannot parade private property through solicitors' chambers because your new husband encourages dramatics." Emmeline rose. "You have entered a solicitor's chamber to argue over a lady's scent box. Be careful which of us appears dramatic." His gaze flicked to her reticule. "Give it to me, Mrs." Alwyn made a sound of outrage, but Emmeline lifted one hand, stopping her. "No." Tobias stepped closer, not near enough to touch. The clerk had moved by then, and Mr. Halford stood. "Mr. Fletchley," the solicitor said, "any claim may be submitted in writing. This is not your matter. You made it mine when you wrote a demand connected to evidence in a disputed charitable account." Tobias's polish cracked. "She is using the Duke's name to destroy people who showed her kindness." Emmeline felt anger rise, clean and cold. Kindness does not abandon a woman in a subscription room. Kindness does not step on her mother's keepsake. Kindness does not demand the broken thing back once it rattles. A voice behind Tobias said, "No, it does not." Philip stood in the doorway. He had not entered as though the room belonged to him. He had stopped at the threshold, hat in hand, face pale, with something held tightly in check. Emmeline's first feeling was not relief. It was wariness. The last time he had acted for her safety, he had left her outside the truth. He seemed to know it. His eyes met hers before he looked at Tobias. "Mr. Fletchley, you will leave." Tobias gave a short, bitter laugh. "At last, the rescuer arrives." Philip did not move from the threshold. "No, the witness arrives. Her Grace has already answered you." The distinction passed through Emmeline with a force she had not expected. Tobias looked from one to the other and saw perhaps that his old methods had no easy place to land. He bowed with venom disguised as form. "This will not save either of you." "Then we are fortunate," Emmeline said. "That truth was not designed for your convenience." Tobias left. The air he had disturbed seemed to settle in layers. Halford murmured to his clerk. Mrs. Alwine pretended to inspect a bookshelf. Philip remained by the door until Emmeline looked at him fully. "May I come in?" he asked. The question cost him. She heard it. Yes. He entered and stopped before the desk, not before her. "Mr. Halford, Mrs. Alwyn, you both heard my fault last night, though not directly. I withheld an intercepted instruction from her Grace, because I feared danger would reach her before I could close it. That was arrogance dressed as care." Mr. Halford lowered his eyes. Mrs. Alwyn's face softened, though she clearly tried to prevent it. Philip looked at Emmeline then. "I mistook silence for safety. I am sorry." No excuse followed. No kiss of words laid over the wound. Just the apology, standing bare. Emmeline felt the tightness in her chest loosen by one painful thread. "What do you ask now? What do you authorize?" He placed a folded paper on the desk. Mr. Halford's clerk traced the paper of the false counterfoil to a stationer near Bond Street. "I can send men, or I can accompany you, or I can remain here if my presence makes the next step yours more clearly." There it was. Not protection withdrawn in injury, not command disguised as concern, but choice returned to the hand from which it had been taken. Emmeline looked at the vinaigrette, then at her aunt, then back at Philip. "You may accompany me to the stationer's record as witness." A faint breath left him. "Thank you. Not as commander. No, not as jailer. Never again if I can help it. And if I fail, I expect you to tell me before I deserve gentler words." It was not charm, it was better. On the journey back toward Briarcliff House to collect the relevant household stationery samples, Mrs. Alwine chose to ride in her own carriage with Mr. Halford's clerk, leaving Emmeline and Philip in the Briarcliff carriage under the practical excuse of speed. For several minutes, they sat apart while London moved in grey strokes beyond the glass. The vinaigrette lay in Emmeline's lap. Philip's hand rested open on the seat between them, not offered at first, simply there, ungloved, palm upward in a question he did not speak. Emmeline looked at it. She remembered refusing his hand in the hall. She remembered him accepting the refusal. She remembered his apology before witnesses, not to win tenderness, but to return truth to its proper owner. Slowly, she placed her hand in his. His fingers closed only after hers did. The hold was not tight. It was steady, warm, and sustained through the turn into Grosvenor Street. Past a milk cart, past two ladies who leaned from a carriage to stare, past the place where rumour might have entered if the blinds had been open. Neither spoke. The silence was different now. It did not lock her outside. It held space for breath. After a while, Philip said, "I was afraid last night." Emmeline did not withdraw her hand. "Of Lady Quince? Of becoming my father?" She turned toward him. His gaze remained on their joined hands. He called every locked door mercy. I despised him for it. Then I found myself reaching for the same key. Emmeline felt the shape of his regret through his hand. Not dramatic, not polished, simply present. "You stopped before you turned it." "Because you left. Because I could." He looked at her then. Yes. The carriage slowed before Briarcliff House. Emmeline kept his hand until the wheels stopped. Then she released him herself. It was a small freedom. It was also a promise that the next time she offered trust, it would be hers to give, not his to assume. When the footman opened the door, Philip stepped down first and waited, hand available, not demanding. This time, after one measured breath, Emmeline took it, the stationer's ledger named Lady Marcella Quince's maid, in a hand too plain to be charming and too steady to be accidental. By the time Emmeline returned to Briarcliff House with Philip, Mr. Halford had already sent a clerk to copy the entry. secure the stationer's testimony, and follow the scent of lavender violet ink through half the polite lies of Bond Street. The evidence should have made the house feel safer. Instead, it made every corridor seem more aware. Someone had copied Briarcliff stationery. Someone had placed a false instruction in Philip's dispatch tray. Someone had known enough of the household to send danger wearing the livery of care. Mrs. Vale met them in the entrance hall, with a face so controlled that Emmeline knew at once there was more. "Your Grace," the housekeeper said to Philip, then turned to Emmeline with a deeper curtsies than she had given on the wedding day. "Your Grace, Mr. Latham has found no servant willing to admit carrying the false instruction. But I have remembered something I ought not to have forgotten." Philip's expression sharpened. "Speak, Mrs." Vale's eyes flickered once toward Emmeline, and there was apology in them. Before her Grace's arrival, the old still-room key was requested from the lower cabinet. The request appeared to come from your private secretary. It was returned the same afternoon. The air changed. Emmeline felt Philip's hand, which had only moments ago assisted her down from the carriage, fall away from hers. Not in rejection, in shock. "The still-room has not been opened in years," he said. "No, Your Grace." "Who took the key?" A maid from Lady Marcella's household was in the servants' hall that day with a note regarding the first charity meeting. I thought nothing of it because Mrs. Dane recognized her. Mrs. Dane, the name moved through the hall like a draught under a closed door. Emmeline remembered Mrs. Vale mentioning an older former housekeeper who had retired after the late Duchess's death, but still called at Christmas for a pension and news. Philip's face lost colour so subtly that only the scar near his temple seemed to deepen. "Mrs. Dane was here?" "Yes, Your Grace," she said. "Lady Quince's people wished to avoid burdening the front hall." Philip looked toward the staircase. For a moment he was not the Duke of Briarcliff, feared and obeyed. He was a man standing before the locked room of his childhood, discovering that strangers may have entered it before he had found the courage. Emmeline did not speak at once. She knew enough now to understand that the silence around his mother was not empty. It was furnished with shame, anger, and the old instruction of powerful houses. "Do not open what society agreed to bury." "Where is the key now?" she asked. Mrs. Vale answered her. "Returned to the lower cabinet, Your Grace." Philip looked at Emmeline. He did not ask whether she wished to be spared. That lesson at least had held. "Will you come?" he asked. Yes, they went, through a passage Emmeline had not yet seen, past a linen room smelling of soap and starch, down a short flight of service stairs, and into the older part of the house where the walls thickened and the air cooled. Mrs. Vale followed with a lamp. Mr. Latham, pale and mortified, remained at a distance with a footman. No one spoke. The still-room door stood at the end of the passage, its paint darker than the rest, its brass plate tarnished to the colour of old honey. Philip took the key from Mrs. Vale. It trembled once against the lock. Emmeline saw it. He saw that she saw it. "You need not pretend it's only a door," she said softly. His mouth tightened. "I have spent years making it one." Did it work? No. The honesty was rougher than polish would have been. He turned the key. The lock gave with a reluctant click. Lavender met them first. Not fresh lavender. Old lavender, dried and patient, mixed with vinegar, dust, and the faint medicinal sharpness of herbs kept in glass. The room beyond was narrow but orderly, as if abandonment had respected its shelves. Brown bottles lined one wall. Bundles of dried rosemary and lavender hung from hooks, grey with age. A marble-topped table stood beneath a high window filmed with soot. On the table lay a ledger, a cracked measuring glass, and a folded linen cloth that had yellowed at the creases. Emmeline stepped inside with the damaged vinaigrette in her reticule and felt, absurdly, as though her mother had entered before her. "This is the scent," she whispered. "Not Marcella's. Mine." Philip stood just within the threshold. His gaze had fixed on a small chair beside the table. It was not grand, it was not ducal. It was a plain wooden chair with worn arms, the sort a woman might use while copying accounts or measuring remedies late into the evening. "She sat there," he said. "My mother, when she wished not to be interrupted." "Did you come here as a boy?" "Once." He drew a breath. She was writing. "I asked why she kept accounts for women who never thanked her," she said, "because hunger doesn't become less real when it is badly recorded." I laughed. I was too young to understand her anger. Emmeline did not reach for him yet. The room itself seemed to require permission. "You understand now. Now I understand too late." He moved to the table and touched the back of the chair with 2 fingers, not sitting, not claiming, only acknowledging. Behind them, Mrs. Vale stood rigid, tears bright but unshed. Emmeline crossed to the shelves. Many bottles were labelled in the late Duchess's hand: lavender vinegar, rosemary spirits, hartshorn, elderflower water. One label bore a familiar phrase written smaller beneath the contents: "For those who cannot afford faintness." Emmeline removed her mother's vinaigrette and opened its bent lid. The scent rose, faint but unmistakably kin to the bottles on the shelf. "They knew each other here," she said. Philip turned. "What? Your mother? And mine? This is not merely the same recipe. Look." She held the vinaigrette beside the bottle. The lavender sprig scratched into the silver matched the tiny sprig drawn on the label. My mother did not borrow a cent. She carried a mark. Mrs. Vale made a small sound. "There was correspondence, Your Grace. I never saw it, but Her Grace, the late Duchess, received notes folded into the remedy baskets. After her death, His Grace's father ordered the still-room closed." Philip's hand tightened on the chair. "And Mrs. Dane?" Mrs. Vale lowered her eyes. She obeyed him. Then later, I fear, she obeyed others. Emmeline moved to the wall where the tile behind the marble table showed a faint irregularity. Not visible from the door, one square sat proud of the plaster by the width of a fingernail. "Philip." He came at once, then stopped beside her, not crowding. She pointed. "This tile has been moved." He took a penknife from his pocket and looked at her before using it. "May I?" It was his house, his wall, his mother's room. "Still," he asked. The question made her throat tighten. "Yes." The tile came free with a scrape of old mortar. Behind it lay a narrow packet wrapped in oilcloth, sealed with dark wax impressed, not with the saint, Aldren arms, but with a tiny lavender sprig. Philip did not touch it first. He stepped back. "Your mother's mark," he said. "And yours," Emmeline answered. Together they carried the packet to the table. Mrs. Vale sent for Mr. Halford at once. They waited in the still room rather than remove the evidence, because both had learned what movement without witness could cost. When Mr. Halford arrived breathless from Lincoln's Inn, the packet was opened before all present. Inside lay an abstract of receipts, duplicate widow names, and a note in the late Duchess's hand, thanking Mrs. Maresfield for preserving what others wished made illegible. Emmeline read the first line aloud, though her voice nearly failed. "My dear Mrs. Maresfield, if ever they call me confused, let the figures answer in a language even proud men must hear." Philip turned away. His shoulders did not shake. Nothing so dramatic, but the room felt his grief as surely as if it had made a sound. Emmeline set the paper down and crossed to him. This time she did not ask herself whether kindness was too soon. Some moments became cruel if delayed. She stepped close enough for him to refuse and placed her hands lightly against his arms. Philip. He looked at her, and the grief in his eyes stripped away every rumour London had ever built around him. "I should have opened this room years ago," he said. "Perhaps, but you're opening it now. After others came first. Then we will make sure they do not leave last." His breath caught. He looked down at her hands, then back to her face. "May I hold you?" The question was quiet, almost broken. Emmeline answered by stepping closer. "Yes." His arms came around her with care, as if even grief must not become a claim. She leaned into him first, her cheek near the dark wool of his coat, the scent of old lavender and dust all around them. It was not passion, it was not gratitude, it was a shared standing beneath the weight of two silenced women, and for a few breaths the locked room held the living without closing around them. When they parted, he did not let his hands linger beyond her withdrawal. Mr. Halford cleared his throat gently. "Your Grace, the abstract is strong but incomplete. The page tying the current transfers to Lady Marcella and Mr. Fletchley is missing." The world returned. Philip's face hardened, though one hand remained open at his side, as if remembering warmth. Then someone entered this room for that page. Mrs. Vale appeared at the door, pale again. "Your Grace, one more thing. A message has just come from a silversmith in Cranbourne Street. A maid in Lady Marcella's livery purchased a replacement hinge this morning, silver, small enough for a lady's vinaigrette." Emmeline's hand closed around her mother's damaged box. The dent under her palm no longer felt only like loss. It felt like accusation. Philip looked at her, no longer standing before her, but beside her. "Now we know who touched what she thought she had broken," he said. "No," Emmeline answered, eyes on the open packet. "Now we know she was afraid it could be repaired." Lady Marcella's invitation arrived the following afternoon on paper pale enough to look innocent. It was delivered to Briarcliff House by a footman in quince livery who would not meet Mrs. Vale's eyes, and it lay upon the silver tray between Philip and Emmeline, as though politeness itself had learned to hold poison without spilling it. Emmeline read the note once, then a second time, because the first reading showed the words, and the second showed the trap. Lady Marcella requested a private correction before the next patroness meeting at the Queen's Crescent subscription rooms. She regretted recent misunderstandings. She wished to spare her Grace further exposure. She believed, with proper discretion, that all names could yet be restored to peace. "Peace," Mrs. Alwine said from beside the fire, where she had come to supervise caution and scold Providence, if necessary. "Whenever a woman like Lady Marcella offers peace, she means surrender with better table linen." Mr. Halford adjusted his spectacles and looked at the note without touching it. "The wording suggests she believes she still controls something we lack." Philip stood at the window, the afternoon light cutting his profile into severity. Since the still room had been opened, something in him had altered. Not softened exactly, clarified. He had walked through his mother's locked grief and emerged less willing to confuse silence with strength. "The current year transfer page," he said. "If she has it, she will not bring it openly." Emmeline folded the note along its original crease. Her mother's silver vinaigrette rested on the table beside the still-room packet. Dented hinge visible, small enough to be overlooked by fools and feared by those who knew better. "Then she will bring it hidden." Mrs. Alwine leaned forward. "You are not considering going." I am considering how to go. That is worse. Philip turned from the window. You need not meet her privately. I will not meet her privately. Emmeline looked at him, and the memory of their last fracture moved between them, not as an open wound now, but as a scar that warned against careless pressure. You may accompany me as witness if you still wish to. He did not answer too quickly. She valued that. I wish to, he said, but only if you authorize it. I do, and if I judge danger to be immediate, you may protect my safety. You may not own my evidence. Agreed. The ease of his answer did not erase the cost of learning it. That made the answer more precious. They went in 2 carriages, not for drama, but to prevent any convenient story about a duke dragging his wife into a quarrel. Mrs. Alwine came with Emmeline. Mr. Halford followed with his clerk and sealed copies of what they had already secured. The stationer's entry for lavender violet ink and blank counterfoils, the silversmith's report of a replacement hinge bought by Marcella's maid, Tobias's written demand for the vinaigrette, and the still-room abstract proving that Mrs. Maresfield had once preserved the late Duchess's accounts. The original vinaigrette remained with Emmeline, wrapped in linen within her reticule. She touched it as the carriage turned toward Queen's Crescent, not for faintness, but for memory. The subscription rooms were nearly empty when they arrived. That was Marcella's first mistake. Empty rooms made witnesses more noticeable. A maid in quince colours opened the side door and led Emmeline not to the main hall, but to a smaller patroness chamber lined with shelves of ledgers and old subscription boxes. A fire burned low. On a round table stood tea for 2, untouched, and a vase of lavender so freshly arranged that its sweetness crowded the air. Lady Marcella rose from a chair near the hearth. She wore pale green, not lavender perhaps because even she had learned caution from scent. Her smile was composed, but her eyes moved instantly to Emmeline's reticule. Your Grace, how kind of you to come. Kindness has very little to do with it. Marcella glanced toward Mrs. Alwine, who had seated herself without invitation, then toward the door, where Philip remained outside the threshold with Mr. Halford visible behind him. Marcella's mouth tightened. I requested a private conversation, and I have had enough of private arrangements made around my name. Philip did not enter. He stood where he had said he would stand, near enough to witness, not near enough to command. Emmeline felt his presence like a lamp placed behind her rather than a wall before her. Marcella recovered with admirable speed. Then I will be plain. You are newly married. You do not understand the charitable world, the obligations of committees, or the damage done when old accounts are dragged before people unable to interpret them. I understand widows were cold while patronesses were praised. A flicker passed over Marcella's face. That is an ugly way to describe administrative confusion. Fraud often prefers longer phrases. Mrs. Alwine murmured, "Excellent." Marcella ignored her. From her reticule, she withdrew a folded paper, keeping it beneath her gloved fingers. There are records that could be read in several ways. Lady Quince would prefer not to injure the memory of your mother. Mr. Fletchley would prefer not to discuss the unfortunate pressure he endured during your engagement. Even His Grace might prefer that his mother's name remain undisturbed. You, Duchess, are the only person who benefits from spectacle. Emmeline's chest tightened, but not with fear. What do you want? A statement, written by you. You will say you misunderstood Mr. Fletchley's withdrawal, that grief made you overzealous in the coal fund matter, and that you will withdraw from all Briarcliff charitable patronage until your health and judgment are restored. The room went silent. Philip did not move, but Emmeline felt the stillness in him sharpen. Marcella slid a prepared sheet across the table. In exchange, your name may be restored socially, quietly, restored by the woman who tried to ruin it. Restoration often requires humility. No, Emmeline said. It requires truth. Marcella's smile thinned. Truth is a costly luxury for a woman whose position rests upon a marriage of convenience. Emmeline looked down at the prepared statement. The words blurred for a moment, not because she could not read them, but because she could read them too well. Nervous distress, misinterpretation, gratitude to Lady Quince for discretion, temporary withdrawal. It was not a document, it was a velvet-lined cage. You misjudged me, she said. I have been poor enough to mend cuffs by candlelight, and proud enough not to pretend the candle was a chandelier. I do not require respectability at the price of my mother's truth. Marcella's hand tightened on the folded paper beneath her fingers. Then you will have scandal. I already have scandal. It is less frightening once one has survived the first bite. Emmeline reached toward the tea table, not for tea, but because a glint of silver had caught her eye near Marcella's reticule. It was a tiny hinge, new and bright, wrapped in tissue that had slipped half free. For a moment the whole room narrowed to that small object. Emmeline's pulse steadied. How thoughtful, she said softly. You brought repair work. Marcella followed her gaze and swept the tissue back, but too late. It is nothing. A replacement hinge small enough for a lady's vinaigrette. Mrs. Alwyn rose in triumph, so swift she nearly upset her chair. I knew I disliked that reticule. Marcella stepped back. You cannot search my belongings. No, Emmeline said, but I can ask why you carry the hinge bought by your maid the morning after my husband's old still-room was opened. Marcella's composure cracked for the first time. Your husband's old grief has made you fanciful. Philip spoke from the threshold. My grief is not on trial. His voice was controlled, but low enough to make the fire seem louder. Her Grace's question is. Marcella turned on him. And you believe her now, before every proof is safe? How touching. Philip entered only as far as Emmeline's earlier permission allowed, stopping beside the witness table rather than in front of her. I do not wait for society to make belief convenient. Emmeline looked at him. Their hands rested on the edge of the table at the same moment, close enough that the backs of their fingers brushed. Neither withdrew. The contact was brief, restrained, and public, yet it carried more force than any dramatic declaration could have carried there. He was beside her, not before her. Marcella saw it and hated it. Then you will both be exposed together, she said. The door behind them opened sharply. Tobias Fletchley entered with the flushed determination of a man who had been waiting for his cue too long. In one hand he held a folded receipt. In the other, his hat, crushed at the brim. At last, he said, a room willing to hear what Miss Maresfield's mother truly owed. Mr. Halford stepped in behind him, his expression mild and deadly. How fortunate! I have always admired documents that arrive precisely when accusation requires them. Tobias ignored him and placed the paper upon the table. A dowry receipt. Maresfield funds promised and never honoured. Mrs. Maresfield drew from the Quince charity accounts to cover family embarrassment. The daughter has done the same in spirit, if not yet in law. Emmeline looked at the paper, then at Tobias's face. Once she had feared his displeasure because she had mistaken it for judgment. Now she saw only desperation dressed in a fine coat. You should have chosen a better lie, she said. This one smells of the same ink, Tobias faltered. Philip's hand remained near hers, not touching now, but ready if she asked. She did not need it yet. She had the table. She had witnesses. She had her mother's broken silver box in her reticule and the scent of false lavender in the air. "Mr. Halford," she said, "will you preserve that receipt?" The solicitor bowed. "With pleasure, Your Grace." Marcella's reticule gave the faintest rustle as she moved to close it. Emmeline heard it. Philip heard it. Mrs. Alwine most certainly heard it. Emmeline looked at Marcella and smiled for the first time that day. "Lady Marcella," she said, "before this grows any more private, shall we invite the patronesses to hear how many things you brought by accident?" By the time the patronesses were summoned back into the main subscription room, Lady Marcella had stopped smiling with her mouth and begun smiling only with her eyes. That was worse. A woman cornered by evidence might weep, rage, faint, or confess. Marcella did none of those things. She stood beside the long table in pale green silk, one gloved hand resting lightly upon her reticule, as if the tiny rustle Emmeline had heard had been imagined by everyone impolite enough to notice it. Tobias Fletchley stood near the mantel with his false dowry receipt now in Mr. Halford's possession, his complexion sharpened by the ugly understanding that the paper had not destroyed Emmeline as cleanly as promised. Lady Quince entered last. She came in black moire, chin lifted, shoulders arranged beneath lace, as if rank were armour and motherhood a legal defence. Behind her came Lady Pennick, old enough to ignore pressure and rich enough to survive it, Mr. Barrow the treasurer, 2 committee ladies, 3 witnesses who had lingered after the earlier meeting, and Mrs. Alwine, whose bonnet ribbons trembled with righteous delight. Philip remained near the witness table, not at Emmeline's side so closely that she disappeared into his consequence, but close enough that the room could not pretend she stood alone. The same chandeliers shone above them. The same subscription book lay open. The same mahogany table that had once held whispers now waited for proof. Emmeline placed her mother's silver vinaigrette at the centre of it. The dented lid caught the light. A quiet moved through the room, thinner than fear and sharper than curiosity. Some of these women had watched Tobias step on it. Others had only heard that he had. Every one of them now saw that the broken object had returned not as a relic of humiliation, but as an accusation. Lady Quince looked at it with distaste. "Duchess, this display is unnecessary." "So was the first one," Emmeline said. "Yet you allowed it." A small murmur stirred and died. Lady Quince turned to Philip. "Your Grace, surely you will not permit a charitable meeting to become an attack upon ladies who have served the poor for years." Philip's gaze did not leave Emmeline. "I will permit her Grace to finish the question your daughter began." Marcella lifted her chin. "I began no question." "Then I shall," Emmeline said. She took the false counterfoil from Mr. Halford's clerk and laid it beside the vinaigrette. "This paper was produced to suggest that I solicited a pledge under Briarcliff authority before my marriage was known. It bears my initials, but not my hand. It also bears the scent of lavender violet notepaper, not the scent of coal, ink, dust, or the subscription desk." Lady Quince gave a short laugh. "Scent is not evidence." "No," Emmeline said. "Scent is a path. Evidence is where the path leads." Mr. Halford stepped forward and placed a copied entry on the table. "The stationer in Bond Street confirms that blank counterfoil paper of the same size and make was ordered by a maid in Lady Marcella Quince's household, together with lavender violet ink and notepaper." Marcella's hand tightened once upon her reticule. "Servants buy paper constantly." "Indeed," Emmeline said, "which is why we asked what else she bought." Mr. Halford laid down the silversmith's receipt. a replacement hinge, silver, small, suitable for a lady's vinaigrette. The eyes in the room moved, one by one, from the receipt to the dented box. Marcella laughed lightly. Are we now to say no woman in London owns a vinaigrette? No, Emmeline answered. We are to ask why your maid purchased a hinge after mine was crushed, and why you brought such a hinge today in your reticule. This time the silence did not fall. It struck. Lady Quince rose halfway. You will not search my daughter. No one has proposed it, Emmeline said, but Lady Marcella is free to remove any doubt by opening the reticule herself. Marcella's eyes flashed. I don't submit to vulgar inspection. Lady Pennick leaned upon her cane. My dear, when a lady carries proof into a room, she ought not to object when the room notices. Tobias stepped forward. This is absurd. The Duchess distracts you with scent boxes and hinges while the real issue remains her mother's debt. He gestured toward Mr. Halford. The receipt shows Mrs. Maresfield owed the Quince fund. Mr. Halford lifted the document with professional calm. This receipt is dated the 3rd of February, 1837. Yes, Tobias snapped. Mrs. Maresfield was dead by then, Emmeline said. The room froze. Tobias's lips parted. Lady Quince closed her fan with a crack. Emmeline felt the old wound of her mother's death pass through her, but it did not weaken her voice. My mother died in November of the previous year. Her burial is entered in the parish register. Mr. Halford has the copy. So either Mrs. Maresfield returned from the grave to borrow from Lady Quince, or someone forged a dead woman's obligation because living women were proving inconvenient. Lady Pennick whispered. Good heavens, Mrs. Alwyn said, not quietly enough, at last, an accurate use of the phrase. Marcella turned on Tobias. The look was fast, furious, and revealing. He looked back with the panic of an accomplice who had been promised the lie would hold. Emmeline saw it. So did Philip, and for the first time since entering the room, he moved, not toward Emmeline, toward the door. He stood before it with one hand behind his back, controlled and unmistakable. No one leaves with evidence unresolved. Lady Quince's face hardened. You cannot detain ladies of standing. I can keep a public accusation from becoming a private disappearance. He looked to Emmeline. If her grace wishes the meeting to continue. The room turned to her. There it was. Choice placed openly in her hands. It continues, she said. Mr. Barrow, the treasurer, had gone very pale. His fingers fluttered near the subscription book. Emmeline looked at him, not cruelly. Mr. Barrow, why did the duplicate book disappear? I misplaced it. Before or after Lady Marcella presented the false counterfoil, his mouth worked. Lady Quince said sharply, Mr. Barrow need not answer a cross-examination. He need only answer a charity committee asking why widows' coal money vanished, Lady Pennick said. That seems rather within our interest. Mr. Barrow sagged. I was told the book would be returned. Lady Quince said, old irregularities must not disturb public confidence. Lady Marcella said the Duchess had already drawn scandal, and the book would only confuse matters. Marcella's voice cut across him. You are overwrought. No, Emmeline said. He is late. She placed the still-room abstract upon the table, its old seal broken in Mr. Halford's presence, its figures copied from a time when her mother and the late Duchess had tried to preserve truth. These old accounts show false widow names receiving coal money years ago, the pattern continued. The only missing proof is the current year transfer page. Lady Quince's eyes flicked, not to Tobias, not to the door, but to Marcella's reticule. It was no more than a second. It was enough. Mrs. Alwyn saw it and sat straighter, like a hound that had scented fox. Emmeline did not pounce. She had learned from Philip that restraint could be more dangerous than force when it left no excuse for outrage. "Lady Marcella," she said, "you came here to ask me to sign away my place in Briarcliff Charities. You brought a prepared statement. You brought a hinge. Mr. Fletchley brought a false receipt dated after my mother's death. Shall we finish with what else you brought?" Marcella's composure trembled. "This is persecution." "No," Philip said quietly. "This is sequence." Lady Pennick lifted her cane and pointed toward Marcella's maid, who had remained near the side door, white-faced and shaking. "Child, if you know where that paper is, now is the last moment to choose decency before loyalty ruins you." Marcella spun. "Do not speak to my maid." The girl burst into tears. "My lady, I only sewed it where you told me. I didn't read it. I swear I didn't." The room inhaled as one. Marcella's hand clamped over the reticule. Philip did not move. Emmeline did. She crossed to the maid, not Marcella, and lowered her voice. "What is your name?" "Alice, your grace." "Alice, no one here will blame a servant for obeying fear if she tells the truth before fear commands another lie." The girl looked at Lady Quince, then at Marcella, then at the old ladies around the table. Finally, she reached for Marcella's reticule with trembling hands. Marcella snatched it back. "You insolent creature." Lady Pennick rose. "Give the girl the reticule, Lady Marcella, or I shall call every patroness in London to ask why you would not." That threat, more than law, broke her. Marcella released it. Alice opened the lining seam with a small pair of scissors from her apron. From beneath the silk, folded narrow and flat, came a page covered in transfer entries. Mr. Halford took it with reverence sharper than triumph. He read silently. His expression changed. "Current year transfers," he said. "False widow names. Payments redirected through an account connected to Mr. Fletchley's debt instrument." Tobias made a sound. Lady Quince sat down as if age had arrived all at once. Emmeline looked at the page, then at the vinaigrette, then at the women who had watched her fall and now watched truth rise in her place. She did not feel victorious. Victory was too loud a word. She felt steady. "If my mother owed the fund," she said, her voice carrying to the far wall, "why did Lady Quince need false widows to receive its money?" No one answered. No one could. At last, the room that had once believed her silence now had to hear it filled with proof. For several seconds after Mr. Halford read the transfer page aloud, no one in the Queen's Crescent subscription rooms seemed able to move. The chandeliers burned steadily above them. The coal fire whispered in the grate. The subscription book lay open where Emmeline had once written names for widows who needed warmth, and around that same table sat the women who had allowed kindness to be turned into a weapon against her. Mr. Halford placed the missing page beside the stillroom abstract, the stationer's ledger copy, the silversmith's hinge receipt, the false counterfoil, Tobias Fletchley's demand for the vinaigrette, and the dowry receipt dated after Mrs. Maresfield's death. The order of it mattered. Lies often depended upon confusion. Truth, when finally given room, preferred sequence. Lady Quince sat rigid in her chair, one hand closed around her fan until the ivory sticks creaked. Lady Marcella stood beside her, pale now beneath the carefully arranged softness of her face. Tobias looked toward the door, but Philip remained there, not blocking it with theatrics, only making clear that no gentleman would escape a room after using it to destroy a woman. Lady Pennick broke the silence first. "Mr. Halford, repeat the conclusion without delicacy. I am too old to have fraud wrapped in tissue." The solicitor inclined his head. "The current year page shows." that funds pledged to the widow's coal subscription were redirected through false beneficiary names into an account connected to a debt instrument held against Mr. Fletchley. The older abstract, preserved by the late Mrs. Maresfield and hidden in the late Duchess of Briarcliff's stillroom, shows the same pattern existed years ago under Lady Quince's committee authority. Lady Quince rose. This is a grotesque misinterpretation. Committees use intermediaries. Records are complicated. Cold is not complicated, Emmeline said. Her voice was quieter than Lady Quince's, but it carried farther. A widow either receives coal or she does not. Mr. Barrow covered his face. Alice, Marcella's maid, wept silently near Mrs. Alwine, who had placed herself between the girl and Lady Quince's rage. With the implacable courage of an elderly woman who had waited years to be useful at precisely the right moment, Tobias tried to recover with a laugh. Surely no one will take the word of a frightened maid and a duchess eager to avenge a broken engagement. Philip turned his head. You forged a dead woman's debt, Mr. Fletchley. Do not ask the room to admire your confidence. Tobias's face mottled. I did what any man would do when threatened by a woman determined to ruin him. No, Emmeline said. You did what a small man does when he believes a woman's silence can be purchased with shame. Marcella's composure cracked at last. You would have been nothing without his name. She pointed at Philip, but her eyes were on Emmeline. Nothing, a discarded gentlewoman with a damaged trinket, and a mother remembered by no one who mattered. The cruelty in the words was so naked that even Lady Quince flinched. Emmeline looked at her mother's silver vinaigrette at the centre of the table. The hinge was still bent. The dent still marked the lid, yet there it sat, surrounded by proof, because broken things could carry truth if no one was allowed to sweep them away. My mother mattered to the widows whose coal she counted, Emmeline said. She mattered to the Duchess whose name she tried to save. She mattered to me before anyone in this room learned to pronounce my married title. If society failed to remember her, that is society's disgrace, not hers. Lady Pennick struck the floor once with her cane. Well said. That small sound seemed to release the room. Voices rose, shocked, angry, eager to move themselves from complicity to correction. Lady Quince attempted to command the treasurer to close the books pending private review, but Mr. Barrow shook his head, too ruined for obedience. No, my lady, no more private review. Mr. Halford gathered the evidence into a leather folder. These papers will be preserved and copied. Mr. Fletchley's creditors and the proper legal channels will be informed. The forged receipt will be examined. The debt instrument will not remain politely hidden. Tobias stepped back as if the folder were a blade. You cannot do this to me. Emmeline met his eyes. Once, his displeasure had shaped the weather of her days. Now it seemed small enough to pity and dangerous enough to expose. I am not doing this to you. I am refusing to carry what you did. Lady Quince turned to the patronesses. You will regret treating family misfortune as public spectacle. Lady Pennick lifted her chin. Lady Quince, you used public charity to conceal private theft. You will resign your patronage before leaving this room, or I shall ensure every subscription list in London asks why you did not. The older women murmured agreement, some from conscience, some from terror of being on the wrong side of a scandal now that the wind had changed. Lady Quince's face collapsed inward by degrees, her fan lowered. Marcella whispered, "Mamma." No answer came. The resignation, when spoken, was brittle and bloodless. Lady Marcella's followed under pressure, stripped of elegance by the presence of her maid, her hinge, her reticule, and the page she had hidden in silk lining, like a conscience she hoped never to wear. When it was done, when Tobias had been placed under Mr. Halford's immediate notice and Lady Quince had been escorted to a chair, by women who no longer dared appear loyal, the room turned again toward Emmeline. That was the strangest moment, not the exposure, not the gasps, not even the punishment of those who had arranged her humiliation. It was the sudden attention of people who wished to admire what they had failed to defend. She felt no hunger for it. Public validation, she discovered, did not feel like applause. It felt like the return of a stolen weight. Philip stepped forward at last, not to stand before her, beside her. His voice, when he spoke, held the room without effort. There remains one truth that should not be left to gossip. Emmeline looked at him. She knew some part of what he would say, but not all. He had promised one day to tell her why the name Maresfield had stopped him at the door. That day had arrived in the room where she had been discarded. I first chose Miss Maresfield because of a debt justice owed her family, he said. Her mother preserved the accounts that might have saved my mother from years of false disgrace. When I saw the lavender mark inside the vinaigrette, I recognized a name my house had failed to honor aloud. A murmur moved through the women. Philip did not look away from Emmeline. But that is not why I remain before you as her husband. I saw her abandoned in this room, and she did not beg. I saw her accused in this room, and she observed what others hoped she would miss. I saw her hurt by my own mistaken protection, and she had the courage to leave a duke's house rather than accept silence as shelter. The last sentence struck her more deeply than any praise. He had not hidden his fault. He had placed it where society could see it, not to degrade himself, but to make her wound real. The first injustice after our marriage was mine, he continued. I mistook silence for protection. I apologize for it here because the harm touched her publicly once the world used her absence as guilt. Her grace did not flee truth. She went to find it where men had delayed giving it to her. Mrs. Alwine pressed a handkerchief to her mouth. Emmeline could not look at her. Philip's voice lowered, not in volume, but in distance, until the words seemed meant for Emmeline, though the room heard them. I chose your name because justice owed it a witness. I choose you now because I love you. The room vanished at the edges. Not entirely. Propriety remained. Witnesses remained, pain remained, yet inside her, something long braced against humiliation loosened. He had not said love when it could be mistaken for rescue. He had said it after evidence, after apology, after giving her the room. Emmeline's eyes stung, but she smiled through it. Then hear me as clearly, she said. I love you, Philip, not for rescuing me, but for learning to stand beside me. A breath moved through the room, softer than gossip, and far more dangerous to those who had relied upon women never being loved for their strength. Later, after Mr. Halford had sealed the evidence and Lady Pennick had taken command of the committee with alarming satisfaction, Philip and Emmeline stepped into the candlelit passage outside the subscription rooms. Mrs. Alwine remained at the open doorway, near enough to satisfy propriety and far enough to pretend she was studying a notice about coal deliveries. For a moment, neither spoke. The sounds of consequence continued behind them. Papers folded, chairs moved. Lady Quince's voice broke once and then disappeared beneath Lady Pennick's. Philip turned to Emmeline with a gravity that made her heart ache. May I kiss you, Emmeline? The question did not diminish the feeling. It made room for her inside it. She stepped closer by her own will. Yes, she said, because I choose it. His hand rose slowly, giving her time even then, and rested lightly at her cheek only after she did not turn away. The kiss was gentle, brief, and more solemn than triumphant. It tasted of tears she had not shed, and a future neither of them had known how to name a week before. When he drew back, his forehead nearly touched hers, but not quite. He waited. Emmeline closed the remaining space and rested there for one breath. "The vinaigrette," he said softly. "Do you want it repaired or left as it is?" She looked through the open doorway to the table where the dented silver still caught the light among the papers that had freed two mothers' names. "Both," she said. "Let the hinge work again. Let the mark remain." Philip's eyes warmed in a way no candle could explain. "Then both it shall be." Weeks later, when winter laid its pale hand over Dorset and the sea below, Briarcliff Hall turned the colour of hammered pewter. Emmeline stood in the restored still room with her mother's silver vinaigrette open in her palm. The room no longer smelled of abandonment. Lavender hung from the beams in fresh-cut bundles, rosemary dried near the hearth, and clean glass bottles caught the thin morning light along shelves, scrubbed free of old dust. On the marble table lay two folded notes beneath a paperweight. One copied from Mrs. Maresfield's hand, preserving the accounts that had answered falsehood after death, and one from the late Duchess of Briarcliff, thanking a friend brave enough to make figures speak when society preferred silence. Mr. Halford had taken the originals into his archive at Lincoln's Inn, sealed and copied, with a thoroughness that would have comforted any honest widow and alarmed every dishonest committee in London. The evidence no longer wandered in reticules, coat pockets, and locked rooms. It had a legal home. So, at last, did memory. Emmeline lifted the vinaigrette toward the window. The silversmith had repaired the hinge as Philip had promised. The lid opened smoothly now, and the delicate inner grille sat straight again. Yet the dent remained at the edge, a small crescent where Tobias Fletchley's boot had once crushed silver and assumed that damage was the same as defeat. Emmeline had insisted the mark not be polished away. The silversmith had stared at her as if a duchess, requesting visible imperfection, must be obeyed very carefully or not understood at all. Philip had understood. He had only nodded and said, "Then the hinge shall work, and the wound shall tell the truth." From the courtyard beyond the still-room windows came the sound of cart wheels and men's voices. Briarcliff Charity Coal was being loaded for the coastal villages and the inland parish cottages, but not under the old system of elegant vagueness. Every widow's name had been written plainly. Every load had a counterfoil. Every receipt would be checked by a committee that included the vicar, two village matrons, Mrs. Vale, and, to the alarm of several gentlemen, Emmeline herself. Lady Pennick had written from London with brisk approval, and 3 underlined instructions about never allowing charitable vanity near unlocked cash boxes. Lady Quince had resigned from every public patronage where resignation could be forced and withdrawn from those where it could not. Marcella had been sent to relatives in Bath, where her beauty would still be admired, but her reticule would never again be trusted without suspicion. Tobias Fletchley, according to Mr. Halford's most recent letter, had discovered that creditors were less sentimental than jilted fiancé and far harder to silence. Emmeline felt no pleasure in imagining his ruin. She felt only the quiet relief of not carrying it for him. She set the vinaigrette on the marble table and opened the small brown bottle beside it. The lavender vinegar had been made from the late Duchess's recipe, sharpened just enough to clear the senses and softened by herbs from Briarcliff's winter garden. As she poured a little onto the sponge beneath the grill, the scent rose, bright and clean. Not Marcella's powdery violet, not the stale air of a room where women smiled over accusation. This lavender belonged to sickbeds tended without applause, to ledgers copied by candlelight, to two mothers who had understood that care without accuracy could become another kind of cruelty. "You have made it breathe again," Philip said from the doorway. Emmeline looked up. He stood just outside the still room, as he always did now until invited, though the room was his by inheritance and hers by choice. In the weeks since London, he had learned a dozen new pauses. He paused before advising, before assisting, before answering for her in company. Sometimes the pause made him look sterner than before. Sometimes it made him look younger. Today, with winter light on his dark hair and no city armor in his expression, he looked simply tired in the way healing men sometimes looked when peace still felt unfamiliar. "Come in," she said. He did. His gaze went first to the vinaigrette, then to the copied notes, then to the account books stacked at the end of the table. The first coal carts leave within the hour. Mrs. Vale has already frightened the steward into admitting his figures were untidy rather than fraudulent. A useful distinction. She said she learned it from you. Then I have improved the household. You have overturned it completely. Emmeline arched a brow. Your Grace, that sounds dangerously like admiration. It is worse, he said. It is gratitude under supervision. She smiled, and the still room seemed warmer for it. Yet Philip did not smile back at once. He came to the table and touched the edge of the repaired vinaigrette with one finger, careful not to move it. I feared this would hurt you. It did. His hand stilled. I mean after the repair. So do I. Emmeline closed the lid gently, then opened it again to hear the hinge work. It hurt when it was crushed. It hurt when it rattled with secrets. It hurt when it became evidence. Now it hurts differently. Differently enough to keep? Differently enough to use? Philip's face altered. I was afraid you would look at it and remember the first time I failed you. Philip. She turned toward him fully. You did not step on it. No, I tried to lock doors around it. And then you opened them. After you left, because I could leave. He absorbed that, as he always did now, without rushing to soften it. That was one of the reasons she loved him. Not because he never erred, but because he no longer tried to make his intentions louder than the harm. I am still learning how to love without command, he said. And I am still learning how to be cared for without looking for the cage. The confession settled between them gently. There had been louder victories in London. This one mattered more. Emmeline placed the repaired vinaigrette beside her mother's copied note and the lavender jar. Then we shall keep learning in a room where nothing is hidden behind a tile. His eyes warmed. That seems a formidable marriage program. You married a woman who requested coal tallies on her first morning as a duchess. You were warned. Not sufficiently. He offered his arm, not to lead her away, but to ask whether she wished to leave the still room with him. She looked once more at the table. Silver, paper, lavender light. The dent remained. The fragrance returned. That was enough. Outside, the terrace doors stood open to the winter garden, where frost silvered the box hedges and the sea wind lifted the edge of Emmeline's shawl. She stepped into the cold with Philip beside her. For a moment they watched the coal carts roll toward the village road, each load covered, counted, and named. Letters from former patronesses lay unanswered on the library desk. Some apologized, some praised, some tried, too late, to claim they had always doubted the accusation. Emmeline would answer them with courtesy, because courtesy was a tool and not a surrender, but she no longer needed their acknowledgement to know her own worth. The world had watched her abandoned, then vindicated. The deeper truth was quieter. She had watched herself remain. A gust of wind tugged the shawl from her shoulder. Philip lifted his hand, then paused. Emmeline saw the question before he spoke, and loved him for asking it even when frost made the answer obvious. She smiled. Only then did he settle the shawl around her, his fingers careful at the wool's edge. "Thank you," she said. "For the shawl, for the pause." His expression softened. "I love you still." She took his hand first. His fingers closed around hers with the same steady warmth she had once accepted in a carriage after apology. But now there was no witness, no scandal, no evidence waiting to be saved. Only choice. She leaned into him, and his arm came around her when she did not step away. It was a gentle embrace, the kind that asked nothing louder than presence. His forehead touched hers for a moment, warm against the cold air. "And I choose you still," she said. Below them, the first cart turned through the gates toward the village, carrying coal to widows whose names would not be erased. Behind them, in the winter still-room, the repaired silver vinaigrette caught the pale light beside the lavender jar, its dent visible, its fragrance restored. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.